The battle turned into a slaughter. Werner and Klein fought like gods of war, their ferocity shattering the rebels' will to resist. Most were cut down or leaped overboard in terror. Phaedus was run through the throat by Klein, ending his life of betrayal and ambition in a pool of blood. Watching his last loyalists fall and his ships burn, Luoyao was consumed by despair. He seized a small skiff and rowed into the darkness with a dozen survivors, ignoring the Hell's Cape behind him. The carnage marked the final requiem for the rebellion at Golden Scale Port. By dawn, the battle was over. The rebel fleet was annihilated, and Golden Scale Port was finally reclaimed. Standing on the ruined pier, Duke Schmidt looked at the wreckage and told me, "Clean up the battlefield, secure the city, and repair the defenses. Leave a garrison under a reliable commander. We rest for 3 days, resupply, and then march north to Eglinist." "Yes, father," I replied, looking north. The rebellion was over, but a greater, more dangerous battle awaited. The Empress's orders, the Solon main force, and the besieged Eglinist and Eisenberg all pointed toward the coming storm. "We must be fast," the Duke added, his expression cold. "No excuses for delay, and we cannot let others steal the glory." I understood. With Count Rockefeller's forces also moving north, the distribution of power and spoils would be decided by blood and steel beneath the walls of Eglinist. After a brief rest, the Schmidt-Conford coalition marched out. By late December of the first year of Sigmund, the chaos of mobilization outside the royal capital finally settled as night fell. The capital's walls loomed like a giant shadow, surrounded by a vast, restless sea of camps. Over 100,000 troops from across the kingdom gathered under their respective banners. Eglinist had been besieged for 3 months, and Count Eisenberg's desperate pleas for help weighed heavily on the capital and every lord. Faced with the potential loss of the northern frontier, petty calculations of self-preservation were set aside. Speed became the unspoken consensus. Count Rockefeller's elite France City Legion arrived first, followed by the battle-hardened Schmidt-Conford coalition, and then various smaller lords. Over 100,000 men formed a formidable torrent. Despite hidden power struggles, a facade of unity was maintained. Count Rockefeller, the most senior and powerful, was named commander-in-chief. The Empress's stern decree arrived: march on Eglinist immediately. On the eve of the offensive, the final reinforcements arrived: Count Boris's Northwest Border Army, Charlotte's Rhineland Legion, and Friedrich's Northern Iron Cavalry. Though exhausted from recent battles, these troops brought a sharp, battle-hardened morale to the coalition. Inside the command tent, a massive map of the northern frontier lay on a table. Count Rockefeller, Duke Schmidt, and I coordinated the final strategy. Rockefeller, the Titan of the North and ruler of France City, met Duke Schmidt, the Lion of the South and ruler of Franklin. Both were powerful warlords, one my father, the other his de facto father-in-law. Their first meeting during this national crisis was marked by mutual respect and an unspoken, competitive tension. Both men tacitly agreed to set aside the complex relationship between me and Charlotte for the duration of the campaign. The Solon army was the common enemy. Personal and familial entanglements would be negotiated only after the war. I felt the strain of being caught between my calculating father and the powerful future father-in-law who held my and Charlotte's fate in his hands. As the two veterans discussed strategy, logistics, and intelligence with professional depth, I found I only needed to listen and nod, avoiding any potentially inappropriate input. The tent flap opened, letting in the winter chill as Count Boris, Charlotte, and Friedrich entered. The candlelight flickered. Count Boris nodded to the two giants. Count Rockefeller rose with a practiced smile, greeting Boris warmly and praising his achievements in the Northwest. After the pleasantries, Rockefeller's gaze naturally fell on Charlotte, standing half a step behind Boris. The coldness on his face melted into warmth and concern. He hadn't seen his daughter in over a year. Knowing she had survived the bloodbath at Hoynem and was still recovering from wounds, he felt a mix of heartache and pride at her thin but resolute appearance. Charlotte met her father's gaze, her facade finally crumbling. She hurried forward and buried herself in his warm embrace like a bird returning to its nest. "Father," she whispered, her voice thick with suppressed sobs. Count Rockefeller held her tightly, patting her back to reassure himself of her presence, pouring all his worry and longing into the silent hug. Nearby, Duke Schmidt approached his eldest son, Friedrich. With a steady expression and a hint of approval, he patted Friedrich's shoulder. Well done. The Northwest campaign was handled beautifully. Friedrich straightened and saluted. For the family honor, and for the kingdom. Though less affectionate than the father-daughter pair, the mutual trust and recognition between them were clear. Count Boris and I stood aside as observers. Sharing a knowing smile, Boris approached the young Lord of Carnford, who had left a deep impression on him. Lord Karl, I've heard much of you, Boris said, his voice gravelly but kind. To carve out a foothold in the northern frontier, thrive against the Salonians, and raise such a formidable army. Truly, a hero among youths. I've heard many tales of Carnford's exploits in the Northwest. I bowed respectfully. You are too kind, Count. Your suppression of Gustav's 100,000-strong rebel army in the Northwest is the true pillar of the nation. I am in awe. The two exchanged polite praise, with Boris appreciating my humility and I respecting the veteran's achievements. The reunion was brief. Count Rockefort resumed his role as commander, gathering everyone to map out march sequences, task assignments, and contingency plans. Amidst the tense military atmosphere, two gazes suddenly cut through the barrier of maps and candlelight. I and Charlotte locked eyes. No words were exchanged, yet time seemed to stretch and freeze in that profound connection. An intense, private emotional current hummed between them, invisible to the others focused on strategy. Karl, Count Rockefort called out, pointing at the map. I remained motionless, my spirit still anchored in Charlotte's blue eyes. Karl, the Count asked, looking at the distracted young lord with surprise. Yes, my lord, I snapped back, my face flushing with rare embarrassment as I turned away from Charlotte. My apologies, what are your orders? The tent went quiet. Duke Schmidt frowned slightly, and Count Boris looked amused. Recovering, the Count pointed to the map. Your Carnford army will take the rear, handling logistics and flank security. Any issues? None at all. I will obey, I replied, forcing my focus onto the deployment. The lapse did not go unnoticed. Friedrich, standing behind his father, had witnessed the profound exchange between his brother and Charlotte. It was not the look of comrades or mere admiration. It was far too intimate and complex. A cold, sinking realization struck Friedrich. They were lovers. His own budding interest in Charlotte withered instantly, replaced by a chilling sense of displacement. He looked away at the map, his mind in turmoil, barely registering the rest of the meeting. The meeting concluded, and the group dispersed into the night. Outside, the camp was a mix of flickering torches and the heavy, silent tension preceding a major battle. I wandered to a quiet edge of the camp, staring at the northern sky toward Eaglenest, my thoughts a chaotic mess. A soft rustle of frozen earth sounded behind him. My heart hammered. Guided by instinct rather than logic, I turned around, trembling with anticipation. A slender figure stood in the firelight, her short golden hair haloed by the glow. It was Charlotte. She stared at me as if I might vanish, then broke into a run, rushing toward me. She slammed into my chest with such force that I stumbled back. I instinctively wrapped my arms around her. Charlotte clung to my waist, burying her face in my neck, breathing in my scent, the only thing that made her feel safe. Feeling her tremors and muffled sobs, my heart softened, and I held her closer. The faint, gentle scent of her perfume enveloped me like a soft, inescapable net. Her back heaved with suppressed weeping. Hot tears soaked my shoulder, burning through my clothes and my defenses. I felt my resolve melt away entirely. I brushed her ragged, short golden hair. It felt rougher than I remembered, reflecting the exhaustion of the campaign, yet it gave her a fragile, stubborn beauty. What happened to your hair? Charlotte looked up, her blue eyes clear despite the lingering moisture. She wiped her eyes, feigning nonchalance. Nothing. I just like it short. It's practical for battle. Easier to manage. But I knew her too well. Every tremor of her lashes and every tightening of her lips betrayed the truth she refused to speak. I stared into her eyes, which usually reflected my deepest emotions, but now seemed to evade me. Is it because of Klein? I asked. Charlotte stiffened in my arms. Her eyes widened, shock and panic replacing the mist within them as if she had heard the impossible. You know, she exclaimed, her voice sharp with disbelief before she quickly lowered it, scanning the dark surroundings with vigilance. Seeing her reaction, my last shred of hope vanished, leaving only overwhelming tenderness and guilt. I pulled her closer, trying to warm her with my own body. Yes, I said steadily. Count Rockefort told me everything. Upon hearing the Count's name, Charlotte's tension drained away. She slumped against me, burying her face in my neck. Her embrace shifted from a desperate collision to one of profound exhaustion and reliance. After a silence, she whispered against my skin, as if speaking to the void. Klein, he has soft, golden hair that glows in the sun. His eyes are blue, bright like a clear sky. Her voice grew softer, filled with maternal tenderness. But his features, his nose, the way he frowns in his sleep, they look like you, only more handsome. I rubbed my chin against her hair. With you as his mother, he's bound to be more handsome than me. He'll be the most beautiful child in the world. Amused, Charlotte let out a muffled laugh, her shoulders shaking. She playfully tapped my chest with her uninjured hand, a mix of feigned annoyance and shyness. A strange silence fell between them. It was not an awkward silence, but a saturation point where words felt too pale to capture their overwhelming emotions. They had been separated for too long, surviving brushes with death and carrying endless thoughts of longing, fear, and dreams of their future with Klein. Yet, when the moment finally arrived, all their rehearsed words dissolved. Any language felt too heavy or too light to contain the surging tide of their feelings. They chose silence, holding each other tightly as if to compress the lost time and dissolve their shared fears and love. Feeling her slight tremors, I held her tighter, offering my chest as a sanctuary. Time lost its meaning, feeling both like a century and a fleeting moment. Beneath this warmth, however, my guilt grew colder and heavier. Charlotte's unwavering love and the sacrifices she endured reflected my own wavering and the betrayal I had nearly, or already, committed. My entanglement with the princess felt like a poisoned thorn in my heart. I had promised Count Rockefort I would confess. The Count had given me this chance, a final measure of trust and dignity. I could not betray that trust or live with the shackles of deceit. I owed her the truth, regardless of the consequences. I loosened my grip, took a sharp breath of the cold night air, and pulled back to look her in the eyes. Under the firelight, Charlotte's face was pale, her blue eyes still holding a trace of lingering warmth. Charlotte, I said, forcing myself to meet her gaze. I have something I need to tell you. Charlotte studied my face for a moment before asking calmly, is it good news or bad? My heart sank. Her eyes held a flicker of wary foresight, as if she already knew. It is bad news, I managed to say, expecting her to press for details. Instead, Charlotte looked at me for a heartbeat, her lips curving into a weary, fragile arc. She raised a finger and pressed it gently against my lips, silencing me. Her fingertip was cool, calloused, and distinct. Then don't say it. I'm so happy to see you tonight, Carl. I don't want to hear bad news. Not tonight. Her words cut deeper than any accusation. I realized then, she had guessed. She might not know the details, but she sensed the weight of my secret. She chose not to listen, not out of cowardice, but to protect their fragile reunion and spare them both from the pain of the truth. Her consideration made me feel even more wretched and unworthy. My resolve crumbled before her gentle, firm gesture. Looking into her tired, forgiving eyes, I couldn't continue. I nodded slowly, my voice dry. All right. I stopped speaking. Charlotte withdrew her finger and leaned back into my arms, her embrace now light and comforting. I stiffened, then hugged her back with desperate, crushing force. Burying my face in her hair, I whispered with trembling, repentant sincerity, Charlotte, I love you. I truly do. I said it as a plea, a confirmation, and a form of self-punishment, fearing it might be my last chance to speak the words. Charlotte paused against my chest, then let out a low, muffled sound, half laugh, half sigh, and replied, A simple, emotionless was all the response Carl received. It felt as though his heart had been plunged into a freezing abyss. They stood in silence at the edge of the winter camp, two vines clinging to each other for warmth amidst the flickering torchlight, bracing against an impending storm. When the distant horns signaled a changing of the guard and the night wind turned biting, both realized their stolen moment had reached its end. They pulled apart simultaneously, lingering in their reluctance. Charlotte cast one final, complex look at Carl. Without a word, she pulled her cloak tight and walked toward the Rhineland Legion camp, her golden hair fading into the shadows. Carl stood motionless until she vanished, the cold numbing his skin, though the phantom warmth of her tears still lingered on his shoulder. Back in his tent, Carl lay awake, the weight of his unconfessed secrets crushing his chest. Charlotte's final, and her expression played on an endless loop in his mind. Had she decided to abandon him? Was that embrace a final farewell, a dignified end to a broken relationship because she had guessed the truth? What right did he, a man who nearly betrayed his wife and newborn son, have to be her husband or Klein's father? He despised himself for his cowardice and greed. The bitterness of his regret felt like venom. He forced himself to stare into the darkness, deciding to wait until the war ended. The resolution of the siege of Eglinist was far more anticlimactic than anyone had anticipated. When the Plantagenet kingdom's massive coalition of over 100,000 troops finally assembled south of Eglinist, the exhausted Solon army wisely chose to retreat after a brief standoff. This was no mere skirmish. The coalition boasted a formidable lineup: Count Rockefort, Karl, Duke Schmidt, Friedrich, and Count Boris, a combination of talent and cunning that the Solonians feared. Harold, unwilling to risk a decisive battle far from his supply lines against fresh reinforcements, opted for caution. After a few minor skirmishes, the Solon main force withdrew to the hills north of Eglinist, leaving behind a rearguard and rumors of a trap. The strategic battle that was meant to decide the fate of the northern frontier ended with a whimper. Friedrich and Karl led a cavalry pursuit, securing a minor tactical victory by cutting down a few rearguard scouts, but it was little more than a token effort. While the Plantagenet kingdom claimed a victory by lifting the siege, the coalition had actually suffered a strategic setback. Count Eisenberg's garrison at Eglinist was devastated, with massive casualties and ruined defenses that would take years to restore. The kingdom had exhausted its resources and troops for a hollow victory, failing to cripple the Solon main force and leaving the strategic initiative in doubt. Furthermore, the fatigue and internal friction among the coalition forces made future cooperation unlikely. The Queen Mother's order to pursue the enemy was quietly ignored by the commanders in Count Rockefort's tent. Consequently, the massive coalition began to dissolve. Duke Schmidt returned to Frankfurt, while Count Boris sent Friedrich to secure the northern Great Wall, filling the power vacuum left by Count Eisenberg. This move rewarded Friedrich with a foothold in the north and planted a wedge for the Duke. Karl had hoped for a decisive battle to secure the borders of Conford, but with the enemy refusing to engage, he had no choice but to return home. His journey home felt heavy. The anticipation he once felt had turned into a burden. He faced a dilemma. Would he return to his cold, empty castle alone, or could he bring Charlotte and his son, Klein, with him? In reality, Charlotte was returning to France City with her father, Count Rockefort. Karl traveled with them, turning the journey into a prolonged period of torment. The month-long trek through the late winter mud was easy for the soldiers, who were relieved to have survived without a major battle. Karl, however, remained depressed. Since that night, Charlotte had walled herself off, denying him any chance for private conversation. She remained in her carriage or guarded by the Rhineland Legion, maintaining a calm, polite distance whenever they crossed paths. Karl tried to find the courage to approach her, but he always retreated, feeling the invisible barrier she had erected. Every time he saw her carriage, his heart tightened. He feared that night had indeed been their final goodbye. Upon arriving at France City, the city erupted in cheers for the returning heroes. Karl watched from his horse as Charlotte stepped down, feeling as though an ocean lay between them despite their proximity. Once the ceremony concluded, Karl prepared to bid farewell to Count Rockefort and returned to Conford to face his own mess. "Count, the siege is lifted and my duty is done. I am returning to Conford," Karl said calmly. Count Rockefort's tone was firm. "Don't be in such a hurry. Come to my study. We have things to discuss." Karl's heart sank. He nodded and followed, with Charlotte silently trailing behind. Charlotte remained stoic, her expressionless face a frozen sea that refused to acknowledge him. He wanted to speak, to ask about her or Klein, but the words died in his throat. She didn't even glance his way. They reached the study, which smelled of leather and tobacco. The atmosphere was heavier and more personal than ever before. Carl's gaze was immediately drawn to the person sitting on the sofa. I longed to ask if she was well or mention Klein, but the words died in my throat before her icy expression. Charlotte didn't even glance at me, walking steadily beside her father with her gaze fixed ahead. I traversed the castle's ornate corridors to Count Rockefeller's study, which smelled of leather, cigars, and old paper. The atmosphere today, however, felt far heavier and more personal than ever before. My gaze was immediately drawn to the person sitting on the sofa. She was a woman of noble bearing, her features carrying a distinct resemblance to Charlotte's, though her expression was cold and guarded. We had never formally met, yet the hair, the same shade of gold as Charlotte's, only a touch darker, and the matching line of her brow and eyes told me her identity at once. Charlotte's mother. But what set my heart hammering even harder was the infant nestled securely in the lady's arms, a tiny form swaddled in soft white linen. The baby had apparently just woken from sleep. His little face was rosy and soft, his curious eyes open wide, his tiny fists pumping at the air without purpose as he cooed and babbled. No introduction was needed. That was my son, Klein. My lady. I forced down the storm surging inside me and made myself observe basic courtesy, bowing respectfully toward Lady Isabella. Yet my eyes could not be made to leave that small life in her arms. Lady Isabella, however, seemed neither to see me nor to hear my greeting. The instant I stepped through the door, her attention had gone directly to her daughter's face. What she saw there was not the joy and excitement of a reunion with a beloved after a long separation full of hardship and danger. There was not even resentment or reproach, only a near-exhausted, still calm, just as she had expected. Lady Isabella laughed inwardly, a cold, humorless sound. She had long since sensed it would come to this. Solemn vows, pledges of undivided devotion. What were they but the careless words men spoke in moments of impulse, when passion and desire had blinded them to everything else? She knew men too well, especially men like Karl von Schmidt, young, burning with ambition, already holding real power, and entangled in the overlapping, treacherous worlds of the royal court, his own noble house, and the volatile northern territories. Too many temptations, too many variables. Promises so often crumbled the moment they met the pressure of real interests and new attractions. Was her own marriage not the clearest proof of that? When Count Rockefeller had courted her, had he not sworn eternal devotion with burning conviction, as though she were his entire world? And what had become of it? Years had passed. Power had eroded him. The endless burdens of the estate had worn him down. The attentions of other women had found their way in. Whatever small, fragile feeling had existed at the beginning had long since been ground away to nothing. Now they maintained only the outward titles of Count and Countess, moving in entirely separate circles. Beyond the obligatory public appearances, they had nothing left to say to one another in private. A noble marriage, more often than not, was simply a cold arrangement in which each party extracted what they needed from the other. The reason she had not mounted a fierce opposition, had not even subjected Karl to too many hard questions. During her daughter's pregnancy and confinement, the most vulnerable and hope-dependent time of any woman's life, was simply that she could not bring herself to crush her daughter in that moment, to destroy the fragile thing Charlotte was clinging to. Seeing the way Charlotte looked when she spoke of Karl, the light that kindled in her eyes without her even realizing it, Isabella had allowed herself one small, fragile thread of hope. Perhaps this young man would be different. Perhaps he truly could give her daughter the happiness she herself had never been permitted to have. But now, looking at her daughter's eyes, still as stagnant water, and at Karl, who despite his best efforts to hide it was visibly leaking guilt and unease from every seam, that last threadbare hope in Isabella's chest quietly went out. All men were the same at their core. The moment a new temptation appeared, or a more advantageous choice, or simply enough time and distance, whatever promises had once been made faded rapidly, leaving behind only hollow words. Her daughter had followed in her footsteps after all, and perhaps fared even worse. At least she herself had received the standing of a properly wed wife and the recognition of her family. Charlotte, on the other hand. But Charlotte seemed entirely unaware of the storm raging beneath her mother's cold gaze. The moment she stepped into the study and her eyes found that small figure in Isabella's arms, her entire attention was seized and held fast. The frozen mask of calm she had been wearing finally cracked. A light erupted in her eyes, impossibly tender, impossibly warm, a light that belonged only to a mother. Almost by instinct, she stepped quickly forward and, with the most delicate of movements, lifted the swaddled infant from Isabella's arms. "Klein," she called softly, in a voice of tenderness I had never heard from her before, a tenderness that could have melted stone. Charlotte bowed her head and brushed her cheek gently against her son's soft little face, gazing with deep affection into a pair of blue eyes that were the mirror image of her own, her fingers tracing softly through his fine, pale golden hair. Little Klein seemed to recognize his mother's scent and voice. He stopped his aimless flailing, fixed his clear blue eyes on the beautiful, tired face so close to his, and then broke into a wide, toothless smile, gurgling with laughter as he stretched out one chubby little hand, reaching as though to touch her cheek. This image of mother and child. It should have been a picture of warmth enough to move anyone to tears. But falling on my eyes in that moment, it felt like a red-hot blade drawn again and again across my heart. That was my son, my own flesh and blood. He lay in the arms of the woman I had wounded, sharing a warmth that should have belonged to all three of us. And I stood here like a stranger, like a criminal, unsure I had even the right to step closer. Count Rochefort had moved behind his broad desk and seated himself slowly, fingers laced together on the surface, his gaze deep and unreadable, neither pleased nor angry. Lady Isabella remained on the settee, spine perfectly straight, hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on me with cold precision. Charlotte held her son with her back turned to me, her entire being immersed in the long-missed joy of holding her child again, as though the room contained no one but herself and Klein. I stood at the center of the study, bearing the invisible weight pressing in from three directions at once. It was clear to me now, this room was the final court of judgment. Count Rochefort was the judge, Lady Isabella was the unsparing prosecutor, and Charlotte, perhaps she was the wronged party, or perhaps she was the silent juror in whose hands my fate ultimately rested. Whether there was still a thread of hope to salvage, or whether this was where everything ended for good, it would all be decided today, in this room. There was no retreat. I could only face it. What you have done, though you never said a word of it, Charlotte has already pieced together for herself. And I have seen it too, during this time. You carry deep shame. You have been walking on thin ice. You are terrified of losing Charlotte. My head sank lower and lower, until my chin nearly touched my chest. Shame rose over me like a tide of cold water, submerging everything. But the Count's next words fell like a sudden shaft of light into the dark. Charlotte is willing to forgive you and return with you to Cairnford, along with your son, Klein. After all, he is your only son, is he not? The sole heir to Cairnford. He must grow up there. Your only son, the sole heir to Cairnford. This was not merely forgiveness. It was a verdict, a transaction, a cold, deliberate act of incorporating an established fact into the framework of order. Klein's identity was being confirmed and given weight. It meant that regardless of everything else, this child who carried both my blood and Charlotte's, would one day be the Lord of Cairnford. As his birth mother, Charlotte would naturally hold an unassailable position in Cairnford, and the Rochefort family standing behind her would, through this bloodline, forge a bond with Cairnford, and by extension with the Schmidt family, that ran far deeper and could never truly be severed. This was the most dignified and most durable compromise the various parties could reach in the aftermath of a storm built entirely on practical interests. And I, Carl, had been granted this forgiveness and acceptance when everything was stripped away because of a son I had almost betrayed and had not yet even laid eyes on. Thank you, my Lord Count. Thank you, my lady. Thank you, Charlotte, for being willing to forgive me. I heard my own voice, dry and hollow, speaking the words of gratitude as though by rote. Lady Isabella's contemptuous snort, entirely unconcealed, drove through the last scrap of my dignity like a spike of ice. And Charlotte, from beginning to end, never once raised her eyes to look at me. She focused entirely on playing with Klein, as though he were the only source of light in her world, the only presence worthy of her attention. Her silence was more devastating than any accusation could have been. However, the Count's voice sounded again. You must resolve what exists between you and the princess. Do not repeat the same mistakes. This was the condition. The bottom line. The sword suspended above my head. I understand, I answered solemnly. I took one long, final look at the scene on the settee, Charlotte's downward profile, Klein's tiny fist punching at the air. Then I forced my gaze away, turned under Lady Isabella's cold watch, pulled open the door, and walked out. The door closed behind me, shutting everything away. The corridor plunged into dimness. Only a few small lamps burning in distant alcoves offered any light at all, stretching my shadow out long and solitary behind me. No farewell. Not even a perfunctory, take care on your way. I felt like a low-ranking clerk who had completed some unwanted errand and been hastily dismissed by the household. Less, even, than that. My mind was blank, nothing left in it but the impulse to leave. Just as I was nearing the end of the corridor, click, behind me, the softest sound of a door opening. I turned at once. A slender figure slipped silently out into the hall. Charlotte. Charlotte stood in place with the infant held against her, and for 2 quiet seconds she simply looked at me. Then she took a step forward, and another, walking toward me. Charlotte stopped in front of me. We faced each other in silence, the air between us seeming to solidify. She lifted the swaddled bundle gently and held it out toward me. Hold your son, Carl. You haven't held him yet, not once. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I stared at the soft, warm little bundle held out before me, at the wisp of pale golden hair just visible at the edge of the wrapping. And for a moment my mind went completely blank. My arms seemed to move of their own accord, lifting clumsily to receive him, the angle all wrong. Charlotte seemed to read my helplessness. She patiently adjusted the curve of my arms, settled the swaddled child more securely into the crook of my elbow, and guided my palm to gently support the baby's head and neck. And then, at last, that tiny body settled into my arms. I lowered my head, and my gaze could not be made to leave that small face. Little Klein seemed disturbed by the movement. He furrowed his barely there brows, scrunched his tiny nose, fluttered his lashes once, twice, and then opened his eyes. They were the purest shade of deep blue, clear beyond measure, without a trace of shadow or impurity, and they looked up at this unfamiliar face above them with quiet, wondering curiosity. I held my breath, the moment freezing in time. Charlotte watched silently from the side. Seeing the unprecedented tenderness on my face, she felt a surge of complex emotions. If only there were no princess, no complex ties, and no wavering on my part, this would be a perfect scene. But reality offered no such ifs. Perhaps uncomfortable in my arms or missing his mother's familiar scent, baby Klein's face crumpled, and he began to wail. Flustered, I stood frozen until Charlotte stepped forward, expertly taking the child back into her arms. Nestled against his mother, Klein's cries subsided into whimpers as he nuzzled her for comfort. With the child back in her arms, the hallway fell into a heavy, lingering silence. An unspoken awkwardness hung between them. Watching Charlotte soothe the child, I felt the lingering warmth of the infant on my arms, replaced by a crushing sense of guilt for shattering this peace. Charlotte finally broke the silence. Carl, regardless of your feelings, please be careful from now on. She looked me in the eye, her gaze devoid of softness, heavy with a cold calm. Even if you no longer love me, remember that Klein is your son. For his sake, you must protect yourself. Her words cut through me like a dull blade. Not for her sake, but for the child's. She had already accepted the possibility of my lack of love, distancing herself while holding on to their child as the only remaining tether. This wounded me far more than any accusation or tearful outburst. She no longer trusted my love, or perhaps dared not trust it anymore. Charlotte, no. I stepped forward, my voice urgent. I love you. I always have. I love our son, Klein. I love you both. Enough, Charlotte interrupted softly. She clearly didn't believe me, Or perhaps she was unwilling to rely on such fragile, shifting vows. Trust, once broken, requires more than words. It requires time and consistent action. They were both exhausted. She looked away, her tone calm. Don't say any more. I'll see you out. She adjusted Klein's swaddle and walked toward the stairs, leaving no room for argument. I watched her slim, straight back, a figure I once adored, now separated from me by an invisible wall of ice. Unable to speak, I followed her with leaden steps. They descended the stone stairs in total silence, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. Once soulmates, they were now divided by an insurmountable glacier. Crossing the castle courtyard toward the gates of France City, the sunset cast long, overlapping shadows that never truly merged. I stopped by my mount, patting its neck mechanically before turning to face Charlotte. She stood in the shadows of the gate, the sunset gilding her silhouette while her face remained obscured. Only her blue eyes remained clear, reflecting a complexity I dared not decipher. I wanted to beg for forgiveness or pull her into an embrace, but her cold, calm gaze froze my impulses. I knew that any further words would only seem shallow or offensive. Charlotte watched me for a few seconds, as if memorizing my face. She took a breath and said simply, "Travel safely." Without hesitation, she turned and walked back toward the castle. She never looked back, disappearing into the evening mist and smoke of France City. I stood frozen, staring at the path she had taken. My soldiers waited in silence, the cold wind of the northern frontier doing nothing to dispel my sense of helplessness. I knew I had broken something, her trust and our once unreserved intimacy. A deep, icy rift had formed, one that apologies could not easily bridge. She had given me a chance, but the path to her heart was now filled with thorns and ice. I had lost her absolute trust and nearly lost my place in her life. It was Klein, the child with the pure blue eyes, who had given me a starting point, however difficult, to begin again. The journey back to Conford, once a trip home, became a long, painful internal struggle. I had failed Charlotte, betraying the love she held through life and death, and the loneliness she endured during her pregnancy. My past vows now seemed pathetic and fragile against the pressures of reality and my own weakness. My guilt was even deeper regarding my son, Klein. Those pure blue eyes, innocent of the world's complexity, were now destined to face a difficult life because of my failures. I had failed to provide a stable, loving home, nearly losing my right to be a father while mired in another relationship. I was fortunate that Count Rochefort had granted me a chance to redeem myself. I knew the price. I had to make a clean break between Charlotte and Princess Louise. Any hesitation or attempt to juggle both would invite the Count's wrath, destroying my future with Charlotte and Klein, and potentially bringing disaster to Conford. I had to return and face Princess Louise, the woman I had also wronged through their political marriage. Outside the castle, the atmosphere was unexpectedly lively. Edgar had spread word of the victory. Crowds gathered, and soldiers reunited with their families. Brendan and Edgar waited at the gate. "Welcome home, my lord." Brendan saluted, observing me closely. "Are you well? Was the journey smooth?" "It was," I replied, my heart sinking as I scanned the crowd and failed to see the person I had hoped for. "The Solonians have been quiet," Brendan reported. "Only minor cavalry raids, easily repelled. It seems the pressure at Eglinist is holding their main force." "Expected," I nodded. "Our troops are exhausted. Cancel all offensive plans. Focus on rest, resupply, and training." "Understood," Brendan agreed. The Carnford army needed recovery after their long, tense march. Edgar interjected, "Great news. Thanks to our recent victory and policies, our population has hit 10,000. I've secretly trained 5,000 more men. With our current forces, Carnford can field 10,000 soldiers at any time." This growth brought both power and increased scrutiny. The Solonians wouldn't ignore Carnford's rise. With the siege at Eglinist lifted, their main force would likely target this thorn in their side. A decisive battle was approaching. I reviewed the administrative and defense reports. My team had kept Carnford running smoothly in my absence, allowing me to focus on urgent personal matters. While my troops rested, I could not. I needed to finalize plans for the Solonians' next move. But first, I had to address a different issue. Leaving the military arrangements to my subordinates, I entered the main keep of Carnford Castle. The princess was waiting. She wore a simple gray dress, her dark hair pinned up, exposing her graceful neck. The sunset cast a golden edge around her lonely silhouette. She turned at my footsteps. We locked eyes, the silence heavy and suffocating. She looked beautiful, yet visibly haggard. We had once shared moments of cautious closeness and mutual support in the harsh northern frontier. Louise broke the silence, her voice dry. You returned. Was the journey safe? Yes, it went smoothly. The conversation stalled again. Louise looked at the fireplace. Shall I have dinner prepared? You must be tired. I've eaten, Your Highness. I interrupted, steeling myself. I want to talk. Let's walk outside. Louise trembled, her composure shattering. She understood exactly what this meant. All right, she whispered. We walked in silence to a slope behind the castle overlooking the wilderness. The early spring evening was cold, our shadows stretching across the grass. Smoke rose from the town, a peaceful scene that contrasted sharply with their internal turmoil. We walked for a long time without speaking. Finally, I stopped. Charlotte has returned. Louise, already expecting this, grew paler. I noticed. She gathered her strength. Then, I should leave. Where would you go? I asked. Tears welled in her eyes. Back to the royal capital. She spoke impulsively, but her expression quickly turned to despair. What awaited her there? Queen Mother Catherine, who treated her as a pawn. Her brother Henry, who was effectively a hostage. The capital was a cold, gilded cage, not a home. Her marriage to the northern frontier had been a form of exile. To return now as a rejected princess would be a humiliation. Tears streamed down her face. I don't know where to go, she sobbed. I'm sorry, Carl. I shouldn't have ruined your life. She broke down. Her composure completely collapsed. She apologized for everything. The political marriage, her growing reliance on me, and her current dead end. I felt torn. On one side was Charlotte and Klein. I owed them a future. Count Rochefort's conditions were clear. On the other was this weeping, helpless girl. Charlotte was a resilient knight with a powerful family backing her. Louise, however, was an orphan whose guardian viewed her only as a tool. In this foreign land, I was her only emotional anchor. I couldn't simply discard her like an obstacle. I had to find a way to minimize the damage and secure her future. I had already hurt Charlotte. I refused to be cruel to another innocent woman. I realized I could not fail Louise as well. I wanted her to know she wasn't truly alone. You are not at fault, Your Highness, I said. The error was mine alone. I failed to manage things properly. Louise looked at me, confused. I continued, You don't have to go anywhere. Stay in Carnford. Louise was stunned. But Charlotte is coming back. She is the one you love. I would only cause you pain. No, I said firmly. I have a solution. I want to divorce you. Divorce? Louise stared at me, wide-eyed and incredulous. The concept was alien and terrifying, a scandal that would shake the foundations of their social order. Incompatibility or true love are rarely accepted as valid grounds for divorce by the church or the crown. We are dissolving our marriage, I explained patiently. Legally and ecclesiastically, we will no longer be husband and wife. But the Queen Mother and the church would never allow this. Louise countered instinctively. How is this possible? I don't care. I only care that you receive fair treatment, free from the shackles of a failed marriage, and regain the dignity to live as an independent person rather than a political pawn to be discarded. I will handle the pressure. Just tell me, Louise, are you willing to stay in Carnford as a free woman? If you wish to go elsewhere later, I will ensure your safety and comfort. Louise stared at me, my words a faint light in her dark future. Divorce, freedom, staying in Carnford. No need to face the cold eyes of the royal capital, a life no longer bound by titles. The shock left her speechless, tears streaming down her face, not from despair, but from a new hope. She looked at her husband, who was carving a path for her through the thorns of convention. After a long silence, Louise nodded slowly. All right. My decision sent shockwaves through Carnford's elite. While loveless noble marriages were common, a formal, public divorce from a princess was unheard of. When Edgar relayed the order for all officials and the resident priest to gather the next day, rumors spread like wildfire. The next morning, the main hall was tense. Officials stood on either side, exchanging bewildered glances. The resident priest, old John, sweated profusely, clutching his holy symbol. He had performed weddings and funerals, but never a divorce. The scriptures offered no guidance. Louise and I stood in the center of the hall. "Everyone," I announced, "I have summoned you to witness an important matter." All eyes focused on them. "The princess and I have concluded that our marriage is a mutual burden, detrimental to both our happiness and the stability of this territory." The mention of incompatibility caused a collective gasp. In political marriages, this was an admission of failure. Therefore, I, Karl von Schmidt, Lord of Carnford, hereby declare our marriage dissolved. As of today, we are no longer husband and wife. I bypassed legal documents and church decrees, using my authority as Lord to force a de facto separation. It was a bold, barbaric move that avoided bureaucratic interference by presenting a fait accompli. I turned to Louise. "Princess, do you agree?" Louise met my gaze, her voice clear and steady. "I agree with Lord Karl. We are divorced." Without vows or blessings, the marriage of a princess and a lord was ended in a brief, awkward ceremony. I turned to old John. "Father, please bear witness. May the gods forgive our choice and guide our paths." Old John, sweating, recited a generic prayer for peace and understanding. No one cared if it fit the occasion. The ceremony ended. Louise and I stood a few paces apart, the distance now a chasm. Both looked relieved yet exhausted. Louise smiled faintly. "We are no longer husband and wife." "Yes," I replied. "We are free." The onlookers remained silent, unsure how to react. I stepped back and addressed my officials. "Edgar, announce this to all of Carnford. The princess is no longer my wife, but she remains our honored guest under our protection." I glanced at Louise, who offered a grateful nod. I walked toward the exit, the officials parting to let me pass. Brendan and the others dispersed, stunned by the news that would soon rock the northern frontier and the royal capital. Louise watched me leave, a genuine, tearful smile blooming on her face. Free, truly free. Louise was settled into a villa at Amber Bay, overlooking the sea. The villa came with a garden and attentive maids. Louise loved the tranquility, a stark contrast to the rugged, militaristic atmosphere of Carnford Castle. She spent her days sleeping in, reading on the terrace, and walking along the beach. No one scrutinized her as a lady of the manor. She was simply Louise, a young woman living by the sea. I visited once to ensure everything was in order. We shared tea on the terrace, discussing trivialities in a calm, harmonious manner. As I left, I felt relieved to see her tension dissipating. This thorny personal issue was resolved, albeit in an unconventional way. Yet, I worried about Charlotte's reaction to this arrangement. Would Charlotte see this as a betrayal? It was an unsolvable dilemma. I forced myself to focus on my duties as Lord. I would face the situation with Charlotte when the time came. For now, I needed to bury myself in administration and military affairs to prepare for the threat from Solon and prove my worth to Charlotte and Count Rochefort. I threw myself into my work with renewed vigor. I reviewed reports from Brendan and his officers on the 5,000 new recruits. I decided against forming new units, opting instead to integrate them into existing regiments to learn from veteran squads. I immediately dispersed the 5,000 recruits into existing regiments, choosing to integrate them into veteran squads rather than forming new units, with each veteran team taking on 1 or 2 newcomers. I promoted deserving veterans and NCOs to fill leadership gaps, signing a stack of promotion orders to boost morale. I personally reviewed and signed a stack of promotion orders, elevating numerous veterans and junior officers who had demonstrated courage, composure, or leadership potential during recent battles and the Northern Campaign. The infusion of new blood and clear promotion paths significantly raised army morale. Meanwhile, Hector's expanded military workshops operated around the clock. The valley was now a hub of steam and rhythmic hammering, far exceeding its previous capacity. 3 new water wheels powered over a dozen boring machines and hammers. The facility was walled and guarded, with workers wearing numbered uniforms. Hector, now the Northern Frontier's industrial overseer, greeted me. After a brief exchange, Hector led me into the main assembly workshop. Hector showcased the standardized flintlock musket production line, where each stage, from barrel forging to assembly, was specialized. I observed the focused craftsmen using new deep-hole drills and precision tools. Production was stable at over 1,000 units monthly. Improved forging and drilling techniques had reduced the defect rate by 20%. I inspected a finished musket. It was well balanced with clear rifling and a crisp firing mechanism. "What about the bayonet mount?" I asked. Hector demonstrated a new standardized, locking bayonet mount that was faster and more secure than the old binding method. With production secured, I ordered a full-scale army reorganization. I ordered the conversion of most spearmen into musketeers, keeping only the elite spearmen for defensive support. Brendan expressed concern about vulnerability to enemy cavalry. I countered that massed musketry would deter cavalry, with the remaining spearmen acting as an anvil to protect the musketeers during reloads. I noted that musketeers required only 3 months of training, facilitating rapid expansion compared to the years needed for spearmen. Edgar confirmed that gunpowder production was sufficient, though strict shooting discipline was required. I gave the commanders 3 weeks to complete the reorganization and training before my inspection. The officers saluted and accepted the orders. Roland then presented a breastplate salvage from a deserter, showing signs of being cut down to reduce weight. Roland explained that soldiers were discarding heavy armor during long marches because it hindered mobility in mud and snow. He argued that for northern frontier warfare, mobility and endurance were more critical than heavy protection. I agreed, ordering that heavy breastplates be reserved only for officers and elite shock troops, while line infantry would switch to leather jackets. The officers, long desiring this change, readily agreed. Artillery production was also successful, with nearly 500 portable 3-pounder minion cannons distributed to battalion-level units. Over 300 falconets were produced, serving as vital support in mountain terrain. The workshop also produced 12 9-pounders and 6 12-pounders. Cavalry expansion proceeded well, with Edgar sourcing quality horses from the south and the southwest peninsula. I reviewed reports from the Confed-controlled ranches and ordered the recruitment of 1,000 more cavalrymen from experienced refugees and veterans. The Corps Military Council convened in the Conford Castle War Room. I and my commanders gathered around a detailed sand table mapping the region and Solonian positions. I argued against passive defense, proposing active harassment to prevent the Solonians from regrouping after their defeat at Eglinist. My strategy was to force the enemy to attack their prepared positions through constant, aggressive provocation. This pragmatic approach leveraged their geography to exhaust the enemy with minimal risk. I ordered Leon and Thorstein to lead 1,000 cavalry each in rotating raids against Solonian supply lines, patrols, and camps to keep the enemy in a state of constant alarm. The 2 commanders accepted the mission. I ordered Werner and Klein to use the fleet to raid coastal ports and supply ships, ensuring the enemy found no peace on land or sea. The council agreed. The plan would bleed the enemy while training their own forces. Everyone understood that this would eventually provoke a massive Solonian counterattack, which would be the true test of Conford's strength. Harassment is just the prelude. The real anvil is here, I said, striking the map of Conford. We must turn our home into an impenetrable fortress. Conford's walls, while sturdy against traditional siege, face a new era of Solonian cannons and improved casting technology. Osric Castle and Eglinist proved that vertical walls cannot withstand sustained heavy bombardment. We cannot rely solely on walls, I noted, pointing to the outskirts. We need appetizers outside the city. First, dig 2 or 3 zigzagging counterslope trenches beyond the moat, filled with sharpened stakes and caltrops, interspersed with check hedgehogs and traps to create a killing field. As they struggle through these, our soldiers behind breastworks will pick them off with muskets, Molotov cocktails, and satchel charges. Second, build a low, thick earthen rampart between the final trench and the main wall to absorb and deflect cannon fire. Soft earth absorbs kinetic energy, preventing ricochets and protecting the masonry. It's essentially buffer armor for our walls. Third, we must replace our flat walls with protruding pentagonal or diamond-shaped bastions. These will create overlapping fields of fire, exposing anyone attempting an ant-swarming assault to fire from 3 directions. This integrated defense system aims to leverage Conford's resources into a multi-layered, lethal depth. The generals agreed, with Brendan particularly impressed by the counter-artillery strategy. Excellent plan, my lord. The military can focus on cavalry and naval raids while laborers handle construction, boosting morale, Brendan noted. However, the issue is funding. Trenches, bastions, and sustained military operations are incredibly expensive. Our treasury cannot support this indefinitely. Silence fell over the room. Money remained the bedrock of war. I smiled. I have a solution. We need to turn our reputation into liquid capital. I intend to establish a bank. Roland and Leon looked confused. Conford is stable, safe, and fair. Merchants trust us, which is our most valuable asset, I explained. We will create an institution where people deposit idle money in exchange for interest. We then lend those funds to merchants for trade or invest them in our own defense, earning higher returns. This allows us to leverage wealth far beyond our current treasury. The generals were stunned, though Werner noted it sounded like a sophisticated form of lending. It is institutionalized wealth management, backed by the entire territory's credibility, I clarified. Edgar added, it is feasible. We will offer 3 to 5% annual interest and implement strict risk controls. First step, build a grand, reliable headquarters, I decided. Maul, convert the site plan for my new lord's manor into the Bank of Carnford. Maul confirmed the materials were ready. Stop construction on the manor, build the bank instead. The bank's progress was surprisingly smooth. Under Edgar's guidance, construction moved rapidly. Even before completion, the temporary service windows were flooded with visitors. The 3% interest was attractive, but not the primary draw. The real magnet was the credit I injected into the institution. I melted down my own gold and silver tableware and trophies to create standard bullion. I invited prominent merchants and local gentry to witness these assets being placed in the heavily guarded vault. This served as the initial reserve fund, with me promising a 70% reserve ratio for every silver coin deposited. The merchants recognized the sincerity of the Lord emptying his own castle to back the bank. Combined with Conford's military victories and stable tax policies, trust spread rapidly. Commoners, tired of hiding savings, found the bank both safe and profitable. Artisans and farmers soon lined up at the windows. Merchants had even greater incentives. I offered special trade permits for deposits over 10,000 silver coins, granting priority customs clearance and military escorts. This turned large merchants into stakeholders, using their capital to bet on Conford's future. The bank also introduced checks to replace heavy metal currency. However, this innovation met resistance, as people still preferred the tactile security of physical coins. Paper currency requires time and successful transactions to establish credibility. Regardless, the bank's capital pool is growing rapidly, leaving Edgar both thrilled and anxious as he monitors the ledgers. I am cleverly circulating this private capital, using it to pay laborers, craftsmen, and cavalry units involved in my military efforts. As workers spend their wages, the local economy is stimulated, with some funds returning to the bank, while the reserve fund from the castle remains untouched. As long as this cycle remains unbroken and public confidence holds, the system will provide me with financial support far exceeding traditional taxes. Success depends on maintaining stability, avoiding the overissuance of notes, and ensuring continued military and economic success. While the bank thrives, conflict has ignited beyond the borders. Leon and Thorstein have led 2,000 cavalry into Solonian territory. They strictly adhere to my strategy: strike at weaknesses and retreat quickly. They avoid fortified towns, focusing instead on undefended villages, nomadic camps, and supply depots. Striking at dawn or dusk, they scatter Solonian patrols, burn crops and huts, and eliminate resistance while dispersing the elderly and children. They liberate slaves, offering those who wish to follow them a path back to Conford. This brutal, effective tactic maximizes panic and production disruption while draining Solonian border defenses. The Solonian border is in chaos. Villagers are retreating to inner fortresses, and supply lines have become dangerously vulnerable. Leon's ferocity and Thorstein's cunning ensure the Solonian defenders are exhausted and unable to pin them down. I carefully review the constant stream of reports on these raids. I know this is only the beginning. I must continue to forge Conford into an unbreakable anvil before the Solonians launch a full-scale retaliation. A more explosive, personal piece of news has spread across the northern frontier. The Lord of Conford has officially annulled his marriage to Princess Louise of the Plantagenet Kingdom. The news spreads rapidly through various channels. In France City, Charlotte finds this special notice on her desk at Count Rochefort's residence, alongside reports on the bank and the border raids. Sunlight filters through the stained-glass windows of the living room. Charlotte scans the briefing, her blue eyes moving quickly across the text. She wears a pale blue dress, her golden hair neat, her expression a mix of resilience and lingering fatigue. Nearby, Count Rochefort patiently plays with baby Klein on a wool rug. The infant, with his pale gold hair and blue eyes, reaches for the feather, laughing. Lady Isabella watches the pair, her cold expression softening slightly. The grandson has brought a rare, fragile warmth to the couple's icy relationship. The room is quiet, save for Klein's laughter. Charlotte breaks the silence. I and the princess have annulled our marriage. The count stops playing. Lady Isabella freezes. What did you say? Lady Isabella asks, stunned. Charlotte repeats clearly. I and the princess have annulled our marriage. They are no longer husband and wife. Lady Isabella's softness vanishes, replaced by pure shock. She had expected me to handle the situation with discretion, not a public, scandalous divorce. The count is less surprised. With my current power, he no longer fears the Queen Mother's retribution. The Queen Mother's influence in the north has waned significantly since the incident at Eglinest. This act is a definitive declaration of my intentions, aimed directly at Charlotte. The count believes I am sincere, but the decision rests with Charlotte. When asked about the princess, Charlotte confirms she remains in Conford. Lady Isabella scoffs, suspecting a ruse to hide the princess elsewhere, and warns Charlotte not to be deceived by a man who has strayed. Mother, he wouldn't, Charlotte insists. He has staked his reputation on this public declaration. He is sincere. She looks at her son, adding, Klein needs a father. A complete family. He has taken the hardest step. Despite her mother's agitation, Charlotte has made her choice. She picks up her son, who clings to her, comforted by her familiar scent. I am going to Conford, Charlotte tells her parents, with Klein. I'm coming with you, Lady Isabella declares, determined to ensure I am not hiding the princess. Count Rochefort sighs. You'll only cause trouble. Conford is his territory. Lady Isabella snaps back. Are you protecting him? I must ensure he doesn't mistreat Charlotte or the child. Count Rochefort was left speechless by her retort and chose to remain silent. Charlotte tried to mediate. Mother, it's really unnecessary. I trust one can handle it. Your presence might only complicate matters. Complicate things? Lady Isabella was firm. I am your mother. It is only natural I inspect where my daughter and grandson will live. If I have nothing to hide, why fear my visit? It's settled. I'm going with you. Or you aren't going at all. Seeing her mother's resolve, Charlotte realized resistance was futile. Deep down, she felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety about facing the familiar yet changed me and the unknown situation in Conford. She sighed and nodded helplessly. Very well, mother. We will go together. Lady Isabella's expression softened, though her eyes remained sharp, already calculating how to inspect and supervise once they arrived in Conford. Charlotte fell silent, kissing her son's soft, milk-scented hair. Klein, my little one, we will see your father soon. I hope that place can truly become our home. Deep within the royal palace in the Plantagenet capital, Place City, lay the Queen Mother's private chambers. Heavy velvet curtains blocked the afternoon sun, leaving only the fireplace to cast flickering light over the opulent furnishings. Queen Mother Catherine, in a deep purple velvet robe, looked disheveled. Her face, usually meticulously groomed, was twisted in rage, her eyes sunken from days of anxiety and insomnia. She clutched a Northern Frontier briefing just delivered by her aide. The bold headline made her blood boil. Lord of Conford, I have officially announced the dissolution of my marriage to the princess. The ceremony was held publicly at Conford Castle, witnessed by high-ranking officials and clergy. Catherine crushed the paper into a ball, the sound of the crumpling parchment echoing her fury. Divorce. How dare he? A mere northern lord, a nouveau riche who climbed up through luck and cunning, dares to divorce a princess of the Plantagenet royal family. This was more than a broken marriage. It was a blatant humiliation and a trampling of royal dignity. To Catherine, this was a direct challenge to the divine right of kings, tantamount to treason. In the late king's time, this would have warranted an immediate execution order and the leveling of Conford. Yet, the realization of her current impotence brought a chilling sense of despair. The Battle of Eglinest had exposed the weakness of the royal family. The 100,000-strong army was a facade. The lords were hesitant, self-serving, and impossible to command. Eisenberg's troops had been reduced to eating horses, and the reinforcements arrived too late to engage the Solonians. Royal prestige had hit rock bottom. Taxes were difficult to collect, and decrees were ignored outside the capital. The great lords now looked at her with calculation rather than awe. She had almost no cards left to play against me. Send troops? The capital garrison could not be moved. Order other lords? Who would listen? They wouldn't attack a powerful lord who had just forced the Solonians to retreat and was closely allied with Count Rochefort. Any order would likely result in backroom deals or open defiance. Public condemnation or stripping my title would be meaningless, just another display of royal impotence. She collapsed into her chair, tossing the crumpled paper into the fire, watching it burn, much like her control over the situation. Suddenly, warm, strong hands massaged her tense shoulders. It was Victor. "My little kitten, why so angry?" Victor whispered, his voice smooth and soothing against her ear. Catherine closed her eyes, leaning back into his embrace to draw comfort. In this cold, calculating court, only Victor, her lover and strategist, allowed her to drop her guard. "You saw it," Catherine said, her voice heavy with fatigue. That northern wolf cub. Does I have any respect for the throne left?" Victor massaged her pressure points calmly. "I'm not a madman. I wouldn't risk royal enmity for a mere lack of love. I must have a reason, something that forces my hand." Catherine opened her eyes. "A reason? A woman," Victor said softly. "One for whom I would pay any price. One who has perhaps already given me an heir, forcing me to choose." "A woman?" Catherine frowned, filtering through information about me until a name surfaced. Charlotte de Rochefort, that female knight. She sat up straight. "I remember, over a year ago, she left France City and went into seclusion at her family estate." The pieces clicked. Catherine's breathing quickened. "You mean she bore my child?" "I divorced Louise to legitimize my heir and cement my alliance with the Rochefort family." "Precisely, Your Majesty," Victor nodded. "This isn't just love, it's power. The union of Conford and the Rocheforts, bound by a legitimate heir, will be unbreakable." The realization brought only deeper dread. Catherine's face paled. If so, the two most powerful forces in the north are now bound by blood and interest. A rising eye combined with the deep-rooted Rocheforts, they are 10 times harder to handle than I alone. She had hoped their alliance was temporary, but a child made it a permanent, unified interest. "Do not worry, my kitten," Victor whispered, his voice like a serpent's hiss. "Who else would hate to see Conford grow stronger?" Catherine's eyes flickered. "The Solonians?" "Exactly," Victor smirked. "Conford is a poison fang in the Solonian flank. Now that it's sharper and allied with another beast, Harold will be more restless than you. They won't sit idly by." Catherine looked at him with suspicion. "You said the Solonians would deal with him before, but they attacked Eglinest and nearly trapped my father. The timing was wrong then. But now, my actions reveal my ambition. The Solonians will see me as the primary threat. What if we provided them with a little encouragement?" "Encouragement?" Catherine turned to him, puzzled. Victor whispered to the queen, "If the Solonians invade again, we shouldn't rush to stop them. The northern Great Wall is defenseless since Eisenberg's defeat and Friedrich's inability to hold it. We should let them in." Katerina was shocked, but Victor silenced her. "Let the Solonians in? That's inviting wolves into the house. What about the people and the lords of the north?" "The people and those fickle lords?" Victor replied coldly. "Your Majesty, who is the greater threat? The disorganized, raiding Solonians, or me, a man with a powerful army, royal blood, and open defiance of your authority. Katerina fell silent, the cold reality of Victor's words cutting through her facade. The Solonians were a periodic natural disaster, likely to retreat after looting or being repelled by the lords. But I was young, ambitious, and legitimate. With Louise, I could secure the support of Rochefort and the Schmidt family. If I marched south to force Sigmund's abdication and install Louise, it would be her end. The Solonians want loot. I want the Plantagenet kingdom, Victor concluded. We can secretly leak Conford's weaknesses to the Solonians and signal we won't intervene. Let them bleed each other out. Whether the Solonians retreat or I am crippled, we win. We can then intervene under the guise of rescue to reclaim the north. Katerina's heart raced. The plan was treacherous and treasonous, but it was the only way to eliminate me. Compared to losing her throne and life, the suffering of the northern people and the losses of the lords seemed like acceptable costs. Her hesitation solidified into cold resolve. She nodded stiffly. Do as you say, but keep it absolutely secret. Victor smiled, comforting her like a pet. Everything will be handled. Just watch as the northern fires consume your threat. The Plantagenet crown will remain yours. Meanwhile, in Frankfurt, the atmosphere at Duke Schmidt's estate was vastly different. Sunlight filled the parlor where Lady Irene sat. Irene, now the mistress of the house, held a report on my divorce with visible concern. Reinhardt, look, she said to Duke Schmidt. Karl has annulled his marriage to the princess. How will the Queen Mother react? Duke Schmidt took the report calmly. I expected this, Irene. But this was the Queen Mother's arrangement. Won't he offend the royal family? The Duke sipped his tea. Political marriages are only useful until they become burdens. Karl and Princess Louise had no affection. The marriage was a tool for surveillance. Now that my power in Confort is secure, I no longer need this constraint. Besides, I love Charlotte, the daughter of Count Rochefort, and we already have a child. Irene was stunned, then overwhelmed with emotion. A child? Is it a boy? Does he look like Karl? The Duke nodded. A boy named Klein. Karl cherishes them deeply. This divorce proves his loyalty to Rochefort and his own resolve. Irene teared up, murmuring, Klein, I'm going to be a grandmother. She sighed, realizing why I had always seemed distant from the princess. My poor son, suffering through such a difficult path. She recalled the coldness of her own marriage, feeling a pang of empathy. At least he chose to take responsibility. Irene said, hopeful. I just hope Charlotte can forgive him. The Duke reached out and held her hand, a rare gesture of intimacy. Trust our son, Irene. Karl is no longer a boy needing protection. He has grown through the fires of the North. This divorce is his declaration of independence and a restructuring of his future. He no longer fears the Queen Mother. Their future is their own to walk. We must simply support him. He has taken the most critical step. Irene felt the warmth of his hand and nodded, her anxiety easing. King Sigmund, enraged by the divorce, stripped me of all titles, honors, and fiefs, declaring me a commoner. The royal marriage was declared void to cleanse the royal family of the betrayal. The Ministry of Finance and the Merchants Guild imposed sanctions, banning trade and freezing my assets to starve Confort. However, these measures were largely ineffective. My military power and Confort's self-sufficient mines and factories rendered economic blockades toothless. To profit-driven merchants, the royal decrees were mere paper. Merchants would risk anything for a 300% profit. Trade routes to Confort flourished underground. While publicly complying, merchants used hidden paths and bribed guards to keep supplies flowing to Confort. To them, Confort was the most lucrative investment in the kingdom. Unlike the failing royal army, my forces remained undefeated against the Solonians. This meant stability and security for their capital. Confort became a safe haven in a chaotic world. My governance was surprisingly advanced. I cracked down on corruption and enforced efficient, fair administrative and commercial laws. For merchants tired of the kingdom's bureaucratic rot, Confort was an incredibly attractive destination. My advanced financial policies have drawn merchants to Confort in droves. I established the Frontier Bank, issued credit notes, offered low-interest loans, and allowed merchants to use future earnings as collateral. These revolutionary measures have revitalized the market and fueled commercial expansion. While the rest of the kingdom struggles with cumbersome metal currency, Conford's merchants are reaping the benefits of modern finance. Consequently, the kingdom's economic sanctions have become a farce. Merchants publicly denounce me as a traitor while flocking to Conford, paying high-risk taxes to the royal family while earning unprecedented profits. Despite the failure of economic pressure, the political blow to me has been severe. Public opinion has shifted overnight. Once hailed as the guardian of the North, I am now branded a traitor and usurper in the headlines. Court painters depict me as a greedy demon, bards sing of my treachery, and former noble allies are publicly denouncing me to save themselves. I have lost my legal legitimacy, effectively becoming an open usurper. Harold has confirmed the news of my divorce from the princess, though he finds the decision baffling. In his view, marriage to powerful factions is essential political capital. Breaking such an alliance is self-destructive, painting me as treacherous and contemptuous of the royal family. This move seems uncharacteristic of the cunning and cautious man he knows me to be. For a woman? Or something else? Harold mused, shaking his head. Regardless of the motive, he views this as a disastrous strategic blunder. It provides the Plantagenet royal family and jealous nobles the perfect pretext to attack my legitimacy. Yet, Harold sees this political weakness as a military opportunity. My actions will infuriate the Queen Mother and distract the Plantagenets, while recent Conford cavalry raids have already alienated local tribes and lords. With old grudges and my new political vulnerability, a decisive battle seems inevitable. Furthermore, Conford's growth has far exceeded Harold's initial estimates. In under 3 years, it has transformed from a struggling mountain town into a powerhouse with thousands of troops, vast fertile lands, and advanced weaponry. Regret is useless, but Harold remains confident in his ability to crush me. Conford is only 200 kilometers away, practically on his doorstep. His troops, though weary from recent campaigns, can quickly regroup after a short rest. With a vast supply of slave labor to handle farming, his logistics remain secure. He will not attack immediately. He intends to capitalize on my self-inflicted isolation. Harold plans to let the conflict between me and the royal family escalate, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He will send envoys to propose peace talks, a ruse to lower my guard while framing me as a traitor who colludes with foreign powers, justifying a future invasion. Charlotte's actions are as swift and decisive as her swordsmanship. Days after deciding in France City, she quietly departed with her son Klein, her mother Lady Isabella, and a few maids, heading straight for Conford. She traveled without fanfare, as if on a private journey. While I was inspecting trench works with Brendan, a scout whispered the news to me. Charlotte? And Lady Isabella? They've reached the territory? Where are they? Just past the eastern checkpoint, half an hour away, the guard replied. My heart raced. I was completely unprepared for their arrival, especially with my critical mother-in-law in tow. The new villa was luxurious, but the princess was already staying there. Brendan, you're in charge, I shouted, riding off toward the east without even changing my mud-stained hunting clothes. Amidst my anxiety and confusion, I wondered, was this a test, or was she truly ready to start a new life? I soon spotted the small, modest carriage escorted by 8 riders on the main road. I reined in my horse and dismounted in a rush. Lady Isabella emerged first, her cold blue eyes scanning my dusty, disheveled appearance with clear disdain. Charlotte followed, carrying Klein. She wore practical riding attire, her expression calm and unreadable. But as she saw my genuine shock and urgency, her eyelashes flickered almost imperceptibly. Little Klein stirred in Charlotte's arms, disturbed by the sudden stop. She patted him gently to soothe his whimpering. Charlotte, Lady Isabella, you've arrived. I struggled to steady my breathing, my voice betraying my agitation. I bowed respectfully, my gaze fixed on Charlotte and the infant. Why didn't you notify me? I could have prepared for your arrival. Lady Isabella replied coldly. Prepared? To hide your princess so we wouldn't see her. My enthusiasm vanished, replaced by a stunned silence as I struggled to respond to her blatant distrust. Mother, Charlotte said, gently pulling her mother's arm to break the tension. She looked at Carl with a calm, businesslike detachment. The journey was smooth. We're tired. I'd like to settle into the castle, I suggested, I've prepared a new, more comfortable villa at the foot of the mountain for you. I prefer the castle, Charlotte interrupted firmly, her eyes fixed on the familiar silhouette of Carnford Castle. As you wish, I conceded. It is always maintained and ready. The carriage resumed its journey with me riding alongside in tense silence. Lady Isabella observed the bustling construction, farmland, and patrolling soldiers along the way. Charlotte remained silent, observing the new fortifications and expanded town with a thoughtful expression while soothing her son. Upon arrival, they kept things simple. The castle interior remained largely unchanged, though the great hall's long table now served as mere decoration rather than a council space. The former military war room had been converted back into a storage area, as a new facility had been built below the mountain. The castle was now a symbolic command center and a modest residence, holding memories of her and my past. Charlotte took the master bedroom on the second floor, while Lady Isabella occupied a nearby guest room. I moved my belongings to a smaller room, formerly a study, at the other end of the hall. Given the current atmosphere, neither party suggested sharing a room. Lunch was served, but the mood remained heavy. I, Charlotte, and Lady Isabella sat at the long table. Klein had fallen asleep. The silence was broken only by the sound of cutlery. I repeatedly tried to initiate conversation, but retreated when faced with Charlotte's focus on her meal and Lady Isabella's cold demeanor. After the meal, Charlotte wiped her mouth and looked at me. Go attend to your duties. We are just here to stay for a while. She emphasized just here to stay, framing it as a visit rather than a homecoming. I felt the sting but nodded. Very well. Tell the servants if you need anything. I must attend to military affairs. I knew she didn't want to talk, and I had pressing defense matters to address. As I left, only Charlotte and her mother remained. Klein woke up, wide-eyed and curious about the grand hall. Charlotte placed him on the long table, watching as he explored and patted the surface. Lady Isabella's expression softened, though her worry persisted. She leaned in and whispered, "We still don't know where that princess is hidden. His word is not enough." "Mother, please," Charlotte interrupted. "I believe he has changed. The risks he took to do this were significant." She watched Klein with tenderness. "Klein needs a father. If I want to return to my family, I won't push him away with suspicion. It wouldn't be fair to Klein." Lady Isabella sighed. "You are always thinking of others. But what about you? He hurt you deeply." Charlotte paused, pulling Klein into her arms and feeling his warmth. After a long silence, she looked up, her blue eyes filled with a quiet, renewed courage. "I trust him," she said firmly. "That is why I am here. I want to give him, and us, another chance." Lady Isabella realized then that Charlotte had already made her decision. It wasn't blind forgiveness, but a calculated, brave choice made for her child and her own lingering hopes. She was no longer a passive princess, but a knight choosing to re-enter the fray. Lady Isabella softened, reaching out to stroke her daughter's hair, her own resolve yielding to Charlotte's determination. Thanks to Maul's engineering talent pool and Edgar's merit-based system, Carnford now boasted a team of loyal, creative engineers. Working with Brendan and Roland's experienced officers, they were turning my rigorous, three-dimensional defense blueprint into reality. The zigzag counterslope trenches around the city grew deeper and wider, their wooden stakes and caltrops glinting in the sun. Laborers and soldiers packed earth into thick, sloped walls, creating natural-looking deflections against potential Solonian cannon fire. Beyond these, craftsmen laid foundations for new, reinforced bastions, designed to be sturdier than the main city walls. Despite these defenses, 10,000 standing troops were insufficient to guard the vast, expanding perimeter. Brendan and Roland proposed a bold solution, arming the entire population. During the off-season, healthy men aged 18 to 45 were conscripted into a militia reserve for basic drill and weapons training. Women were organized into auxiliary units for medical care, logistics, and supply management. Despite initial hesitation, the populace, well aware of the Solonian threat, responded with widespread support, viewing the defense of their home as a collective duty. Training grounds buzzed with activity. Farmers practiced with spears, craftsmen drilled in formation, and women learned battlefield first aid. Carnford transformed into a massive, war-ready fortress, unified by a grim, resolute determination to survive. Meanwhile, wolf smoke signals intensified along the border. Leon and Thorstein's cavalry units acted as ghosts, raiding and burning Solonian-controlled areas to provoke the enemy. While Conford's cavalry losses remained manageable, the psychological and material damage inflicted on the Solonians was immense. The Solonians began massing larger cavalry forces to hunt down these flies. I had a deadlier surprise, a covert force infiltrating Solonian supply lines and assembly points. This was the Field's Special Operations Unit, under Richter's Intelligence Bureau. These elite infiltrators carried Hector's latest, highly classified invention, landmines. Hector's workshop produced primitive pressure-triggered mines by miniaturizing flintlock mechanisms and packing them with gunpowder and shrapnel into iron casings. Their unreliability, sometimes failing, sometimes exploding unexpectedly, created a terrifying sense of unpredictability for the Solonians. The second type was a pole-triggered mine, where operators hid nearby to detonate larger charges via waterproof cords. These ambushes caused massive casualties and psychological trauma, turning the terrain itself into a weapon. These hidden reapers began silently claiming Solonian lives. Supply convoys and patrols were decimated by sudden, unexplained explosions. Realizing this was no accident, the Solonians were forced to use slaves to clear paths, drastically slowing their advance and crushing morale. However, the Solonians were seasoned warriors and quickly adapted. Harold mobilized elite hunters and trackers to form counterinsurgency squads, sparking a brutal, silent war in the shadows. Forests and ravines became stages for deadly cat-and-mouse games involving traps, muskets, and ambushes. The Intelligence Bureau began reporting casualties, with some squads vanishing entirely in the northern frontier. I reviewed a fresh casualty report in my office, with Richter standing before me. Richter reported the loss of the 3rd Squad and heavy casualties in the 2nd, noting that the Solonians were now effectively countering their tactics. I remained calm, viewing the losses as a necessary tempering of my elite forces. I asked if the strategic goal, delaying Solon's assembly and disrupting their logistics, was being met. Richter confirmed that Solonian logistics efficiency had dropped by 30%, and their assembly was delayed by at least 2 weeks to a month. I ordered continued pressure but urged caution, demanding they capture a Solonian prisoner to learn the enemy's specific tactics and weaknesses. Richter agreed, then hesitated before bringing up the sensitive topic of my divorce from the princess. I signaled him to continue. Richter reported that the divorce had caused a scandal in the royal capital, with nobles labeling me a traitorous, lust-driven man, damaging my reputation. Richter offered to launch a counter-propaganda campaign using bards and stories to clear my name. He suggested framing the divorce as a political necessity or highlighting my genuine feelings for Charlotte to gain public sympathy. I listened silently before shaking my head. I dismissed the importance of public opinion in the capital, stating that my only real concern was Count Rochefort's stance. However, I agreed that they must control the narrative to protect trade routes and maintain the confidence of my subjects. I rejected the idea of arguing over the morality of the divorce, which would only keep them on the defensive. Instead, I ordered the campaign to focus on 2 points: the blood debt owed by the Solonians for their annual raids, and Conford's role as the shield of the northern frontier. I wanted to be remembered not for a scandal, but as the sword and shield of the north, the eternal nightmare of the Solonians. I commanded that all propaganda efforts be concentrated on these 2 themes. Inspired, Richter bowed, vowing to spread this message to every corner of the kingdom. As Richter turned to leave, my voice, uncharacteristically hesitant and lost, stopped him. Richter turned back. My lord. I slumped, head in my hands. Did I fail? If I'd been firmer, resisted the pressure and temptation, maybe I could face Charlotte and my son with a clear conscience, rather than begging for the right to hold them. The question blindsided Richter. As spymaster, he knew every detail of the tangled web between the lord, the princess, and Charlotte. To him, a young, powerful man in such a political climate having affairs was entirely normal. He viewed the lord's return to his family as a responsible choice, a minor sacrifice for his ambitions. Compared to the mistresses kept by other nobles, the lord was practically pure. Yet, Such cynical pragmatism wouldn't comfort a man drowning in self-reproach. Richter calculated quickly, needing a response that was both truthful and empowering. "My lord, dwelling on the past is futile," he said slowly. "We can only plan for the future based on the present. Perhaps the princess's time in Conford provided you with a unique pressure, a catalyst." I gestured for him to continue. "Without the marriage, the constraints of being a prince consort, or the pressure from the royal capital, would you have possessed the resolve to achieve such decisive victories in Tyrol?" Richter chose his words carefully. "That pressure and sense of debt shaped your ambition to master your own fate. That drive built the Conford we see today." He paused. "Every choice, duty, interest, or weakness, made you who you are. Without those experiences, there would be no Conford, and no Lord Karl ready to face the Solon army." "The princess's influence, however small, fundamentally altered the fate of your territory," Richter concluded earnestly. Silence filled the office, save for the crackling hearth. I remained bowed. Richter felt uneasy, unsure if his sophistry was appropriate, but he hoped it offered the Lord a path out of his guilt. Finally, I looked up. The firelight caught my face. The confusion had faded, replaced by a faint smile. I nodded. "You're right, Richter. The past is fixed, the future is ours. The princess is history. What matters is Conford and the coming war." "I shall take my leave," Richter said, bowing and exiting. Alone, I stared into the fire. Returning to the castle at dusk, I found the hall filled with the aroma of food. A long table was set for three. Charlotte and Lady Isabella were seated, with Klein in a high chair beside Charlotte. The baby, clean and fresh, watched the man entering the room with wide, clear blue eyes. My heart softened, though I felt a deep, underlying tension. I hung up my coat and sat at the head of the table. "Lady Isabella." I nodded, then turned to my wife, my voice softening. "Charlotte." Isabella offered a cold acknowledgement. Charlotte nodded, her expression calm, though her gaze softened slightly. "You're back. Sit." The meal began in a heavy, stifling silence. Only the clinking of cutlery and Klein's occasional babbling broke the quiet as the boy curiously studied this stranger at the table. I struggled to find a topic, but under Charlotte's focus and Isabella's icy demeanor, any attempt felt forced. Charlotte finally broke the silence. "Busy this afternoon? Are you tired?" I felt a warmth in my chest. "Not too tired. Things are delegated, and the defenses and militia training are on track." Charlotte nodded. After a moment, she added, "If you aren't too busy, spend more time with Klein." I froze, glancing at Isabella, who remained impassive. Charlotte looked down, stroking the baby's hair, avoiding my eyes. Her words were an invitation, a permit to enter their lives as a father. Though understated, it was music to my ears. I nodded solemnly. "I will. I promise." Klein stared at me, his innocent curiosity dispelling the gloom that had hung over the dinner. The bond of blood was powerful. Despite my past mistakes, my son's gaze touched my soul. The tension in the room began to dissipate. I stopped forcing conversation, content to watch my son play. After dinner, Isabella retired. Charlotte held Klein and said, "I'm going to bathe him. You, come along." My heart skipped a beat. Of course. The bathroom was warm, filled with steam from a full tub and the glow of the fireplace. Charlotte undressed Klein, revealing his plump, soft limbs. The boy splashed happily in the water, giggling. Charlotte tested the temperature, then gently supported Klein, washing him with a soft cloth. Her movements were tender and focused, every touch filled with maternal love. In the dim, misty light, her soft smile and focused expression created a scene that left me breathless. Anna's smile was pure and powerful, possessing the strength to heal any wound. I watched, mesmerized, filled with profound emotion and deep guilt. How many such moments had I missed? Standing by the tub, I felt clumsy and helpless, afraid that any attempt to help would only disrupt the tender atmosphere. Sensing my unease, Charlotte finished washing Klein before finally looking up at me. Through the steam, her blue eyes were calm, carrying a hint of subtle amusement. "You're the father. It's more fitting for you to bathe him," she said, handing me the cloth. I took the warm, damp cloth, my heart racing as I looked from Charlotte to my son, who was splashing happily and smiling toothlessly at me. Taking a deep breath, I mimicked Charlotte's movements, crouching down to gently wipe the baby's face with trembling hands. My movements were stiff and clumsy, but Klein didn't mind, finding the awkward touch a new game and splashing water all over his father. Seeing my son's innocent joy, my tension melted away. I followed Charlotte's quiet, guiding instructions to clean the baby's neck and ears. Her calm, non-judgmental guidance acted like a warm current, silently melting the ice between us. I knew the scars remained, but Charlotte's willingness to let me participate was a profound act of trust and silent forgiveness. She had not given up on me or our fragile, rebuilding home. Under her guidance, I completed my first bath for Klein, though Charlotte did most of the work. I wrapped the satisfied, sleepy baby in a towel and carried him out, Klein resting his head on my shoulder with a yawn. Holding my son, I felt a surge of responsibility and a fierce determination to protect this life. The test continued as Charlotte dried Klein and changed him, but the baby grew restless, nuzzling against her chest. "He's hungry," Charlotte noted, heading to the bedroom. I followed to the doorway and stopped. Charlotte sat in an armchair by the fireplace and began unbuttoning her blouse. Feeling I shouldn't intrude, I started to turn away. "Stay," Charlotte said, heart pounding. I sat in a chair across the room, staring at the fireplace to avoid looking. The room was filled with the intimate sounds of Klein nursing, accompanied by the crackle of the fire. A warm, private scent began to permeate the air. The intimacy of the moment left me feeling flustered, yet deeply comforted and accepted. By allowing me to witness this, Charlotte was offering a level of trust that went far beyond mere parental cooperation. As time passed, my tension faded, and I shifted my gaze from the fire to the rug. "Thank you, Charlotte," I whispered, "for coming back and giving me another chance, despite the pain I caused." "Let's not dwell on the past," she replied. "I want us to focus on the future. Klein needs a father." She paused, then added softly, "And I need a husband." Her words ignited a spark of hope in me. Previously, I had feared her acceptance was solely for the child's sake. Now, knowing she needed a husband meant she was considering our future as a couple. A wave of joy washed over me, leaving me dizzy. I knew words were insufficient. I would have to prove my worth through my actions for the rest of my life. Eventually, Klein drifted off to sleep, his nursing slowing to a stop. Charlotte stood up and said, "Come here. I'll teach you how to burp him so he doesn't spit up." I approached, and Charlotte demonstrated how to cup my hand and pat the baby's back. I mimicked her, patting gently until Klein let out a small, satisfied burp. Charlotte tucked the sleeping baby into the center of the bed. She stood up and sighed softly. Turning, she met my gaze. The firelight danced in her eyes, revealing not the coldness of the day, but a weary, burgeoning warmth. It was a flicker of hope for the future and a cautious, renewed trust in the man before her. They stood in silence, looking at one another. The warmth between them was brief but precious. Drawn together, I pulled Charlotte into a firm embrace. She stiffened for a second before relaxing against my shoulder. I rested my chin on her hair, patting her back as if to soothe her and confirm this reality. Charlotte didn't return the hug, but she didn't pull away, closing her eyes to savor the long-lost warmth of my presence. The hearth fire cast their shadows onto the wall, merging them into one as they flickered. No words were needed. This moment of silent embrace surpassed any promise or explanation. While the icy barrier between them remained, their shared warmth and silent understanding melted a small space for them. After what felt like an eternity, Charlotte gently pulled away. She looked up, her blue eyes clear in the dim light, reflecting my face. "Go to sleep," she said, her voice slightly raspy. "You've had a long day." I released her reluctantly, nodding. "You rest too." "Good night, Charlotte." "Good night," she replied, turning her gaze to their sleeping son. I left the room, closing the door behind me. The cold, dark hallway stood in stark contrast to the warmth I had just left. My heart raced with joy. While I longed to stay, I knew this was not the time to rush. Charlotte had only just begun to trust me again. I could not afford to be impatient or overstep. I needed time to integrate into her and Klein's life, winning her heart back through consistent responsibility and care. I returned to my makeshift study. Compared to the bedroom, it was cold and sparse, Yet I felt a strange sense of satisfaction as I lay on the hard bed. With the lingering scent of Charlotte and the sound of Klein's breathing in my mind, I fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, my exhaustion finally easing. I was jolted awake by a hurried, hushed knock before dawn. "What is it?" I asked, sitting up. Richter slipped inside, leaning in to whisper urgently, "My lord, urgent news. A Solon envoy has arrived." I was instantly alert. "An envoy? Where are they?" "They were caught by our border patrol before dawn," Richter reported. "He claims to carry a personal letter from the Solon leader, Harold, for you. The guards are wary of a trap, so they've detained them at the outpost. Their stealthy arrival suggests something underhanded." My mind raced. Harold sending a secret envoy at this hour? It was likely that Harold was feeling the pressure and wanted to negotiate. My recent raids were taking a toll, and Harold's army needed time to recover. Seeking a non-aggression pact was a logical move for the Solon leader. "Understood," I said, rising. "Prepare my horse." As we rode, I asked, "What do you make of this, Richter?" "It's a plea for a truce," Richter replied. "Harold is struggling with the raids by Leon and Thorstein and wants to stabilize the situation." I agreed. "And what should we do?" "It's an opportunity," Richter noted. "We also need time to fortify our walls and expand our forces. A temporary peace would be beneficial, though we must put on a show for them, and for the king in Play City." They exchanged knowing smiles. I ordered my messenger. "Tell all commanders to gather the residents at the designated assembly areas. Something big is happening." At the outpost, the Solon envoys were bound and kneeling on the cold ground. Confort soldiers stood guard with torches, casting long, menacing shadows. The leader of the envoys remained remarkably calm. He was a man of about 40 with a resolute face, sitting with his back straight despite his captivity, as if expecting this meeting. This was Leon, the former defender of Osric Castle. Years ago, during Heinrich's reign, he had been forced to surrender to Harold after his supplies ran dry. Unlike other captives, Harold recognized his talent and knowledge of southern defenses, sparing his life and granting him a high position. Leon had become a loyal military aide to Harold. He had volunteered for this dangerous mission to Confort, and Harold had entrusted him with the task. I approached, accompanied by my general. Leon opened his eyes. The young man wore a hunting outfit, exuding an undeniable authority. Leon knew instantly this was the Lord of Confort. I stopped before Leon, scanning the captives. A guard brought a chair for me and handed me the sealed Solon letter. I didn't even look at it, passing it to Richter. I looked at Leon with a mocking tone. "Why keep a guest kneeling? Untie him and bring him a chair." The soldiers complied, setting a chair opposite me. Leon rubbed his wrists, stood up, and sat down calmly. "Thank you, Lord Karl. Allow me to introduce myself," Leon said. "I am Leon, military aide to King Harold. He sends his greetings and calls you an opponent he truly admires." I smiled. "Return my greetings to Harold. And please, send my regards to General Sven. I'm sorry about killing his favorite commander." The remark was a sharp jab at the Solonians. It referred to the defeat at Tyrol, where Bragi had been killed and his head sent to the royal capital. Leon paled but forced a smile. "I will be sure to convey your message." I continued, my tone mocking. "The northern frontier is in chaos. Why is Mr. Leon sneaking around my territory in the middle of the night? My guards might have mistaken you for a wild boar." Leon remained unfazed. "His Majesty sent me for 2 reasons. Leon pointed to the letter in Richter's hand, stating that Emperor Harold sought to discuss maintaining peace in the northern frontier to avoid further bloodshed. Leon added that the Solon Empire admired my talent and wished to explore mutually beneficial cooperation. I understood Leon's true intent was peace, which I also needed for development. However, I could not be the one to initiate the request. With my soldiers and officers watching, I had to project absolute hatred for the Solonians and unwavering loyalty to the Plantagenet kingdom. Any sign of compromise would undermine my military and civilian support. I slammed my armrest, shouting, "Peace? You have no right to speak of such things." I rose, towering over Leon, which instantly galvanized my soldiers. "You bloodthirsty butchers! Since your rebellion, you have slaughtered millions of our people, burning cities and paving your path with our bones. Is this the peace you speak of? It is built upon the corpses of the Plantagenet people. My words struck everyone present like a hammer. Leon tried to defend himself, but I cut him off. To me, you are nothing but a pack of bandits and barbarians. Calling yourselves a kingdom is a joke. I will personally lead my army to your lair and wipe out your kind. The name Solon will vanish from the north. I issued an ultimatum. If you want to talk, you must refer to yourselves as barbarians and acknowledge Harold as your barbarian chieftain. Otherwise, there is nothing to discuss. Leon was stunned, realizing he had miscalculated my resolve. My stance was uncompromising. Accepting the label of barbarian would strip his regime of legitimacy and turn any future negotiation into a humiliating surrender. As Leon struggled to respond, a commotion erupted outside the outpost. Torches appeared in the darkness, converging on the square like rivers of fire. The sounds of footsteps, gongs, and shouting officers filled the air. Leon's heart sank with a sense of impending doom. Commanders from nearby fortified settlements arrived, leading a large crowd of serfs. The confused, sleepy crowd gathered, wondering why they had been summoned at such an hour. They had been told to assemble by their commanders for a meeting with the Lord. Militia members quickly erected a makeshift platform in the center of the square. Leon watched in horror as burly executioners stepped onto the platform, sharpening massive, gleaming blades. It was clearly a public execution, and he was the target. I intended to use the blood of the envoys to unify my people and demonstrate my defiance. Fearing for his life, Leon stammered, "I agree. We are barbarians. Please, calm your anger." I offered a cold smile. "Mr. Leon, you are a step too late." I gestured to the gathered crowd and the execution platform. "If you had agreed sooner, lives might have been saved. Now, the people are here. We must put on a show." Ignoring Leon's despair, I ordered Richter to seize the 5 Solon envoys and prepare them for beheading. Richter mounted the platform, holding the letter bearing Harold's seal. He looked out at the growing crowd and began to read. He recited a fabricated version. To Lord Carl of Carnford, I, Harold, chieftain of the Solon barbarians, admit that your army is invincible. We have suffered defeat after defeat. The crowd erupted in disbelief and pride. Richter continued, feigning fear. The war has brought misery. I beg for your mercy to cease hostilities and establish a lasting peace. To show our sincerity, we surrender these 5 traitors who betrayed the Plantagenet kingdom to join us. Do with them as you wish, and please convey our plea for peace to your king." Richter slammed the letter shut and shouted, "This is Harold's plea for mercy. They are terrified of us." The crowd roared. Cheers, jeers, and insults filled the air as the people vented their hatred. They demanded justice for their fallen kin and rejected any talk of peace. The crowd's fervor reached a fever pitch. The 5 envoys, former Plantagenet officials who had defected, were dragged onto the platform. They screamed for mercy, claiming they were merely messengers. Their pleas were drowned out as the executioners forced them onto the blocks. The executioner approached the first trembling traitor. The man wept, begging for his life and mentioning his mother. I ignored him, shouting to the crowd, "You have heard it. The Solon barbarians are afraid. They want peace. But I ask you, is that possible? They have slaughtered our families and burned our homes. This blood debt can only be paid in blood. Peace is for cowards. Carnford will fight until every last barbarian is wiped out. These traitors are even worse. Today, their heads will honor our fallen. Tell Harold, if he wants peace, he must pay with his own head and the heads of his army. Kill, kill, kill." The crowd roared in unison, their voices shaking the earth. I ordered the executioner to proceed. The heavy blade whistled through the air and fell with brutal force. Snap! A sickening crunch echoed as the envoy's pleas were silenced. His head rolled across the platform, and blood sprayed onto me like a fountain. Warm blood ran down my face, giving me the appearance of a vengeful demon from hell. The crowd erupted in wild cheers. The remaining 4 traitors were executed in quick succession. The platform was drenched in blood, and the 5 headless corpses lay in a heap, filling the air with a thick, metallic stench. I stood motionless in the pool of blood. I, Karl von Schmidt, swear an eternal blood feud against the Solon barbarians. I will annihilate them to avenge the thousands of souls lost in the northern territory. Avenge us. Long live Confort. Long live our Lord. The chants echoed through the dawn. Once the executions concluded, I signaled my officers to disperse the crowd so they could return to their daily labor. The site soon emptied, leaving only the stench of blood and the chaotic execution platform. I stepped down and approached Leon, who sat pale and trembling, struggling to maintain his composure. I, still covered in blood, looked unervingly calm, as if the slaughter had nothing to do with me. "Mr. Leon," I said with a hint of apology, "forgive me. The situation forced my hand. I had to use your men's heads." I gestured to my blood-stained clothes. I needed to show the king that I am not colluding with the enemy. Leon felt a chill run down his spine, his stomach churning at the sight of the young lord discussing the beheadings so casually. Suppressing his nausea, Leon forced a stiff smile. "I understand. The lord had no choice." Internally, Leon cursed me as a ruthless, power-hungry tyrant who ignored the diplomatic immunity of envoys. I sat down and brushed the blood off my clothes as if it were mere dust. "Now that the distractions are gone, let's talk business." Leon took a deep breath, steadying his voice. "Of course, my lord." He lowered his voice to deliver Harold's core message. "His Majesty only wants to ask you one thing. Once the tree is felled, the axe is no longer needed." I nodded slightly, showing no surprise. I leaned back, hands clasped, staring at Leon without confirming or denying the implication. I understood the warning. Once the Solon threat was gone, I, the axe, would become a liability to the Plantagenet kingdom. The kingdom had tolerated my rise only because they needed me to cut down the tree of Solon. Once Solon was defeated, my power would make me a threat to the royal capital. Harold's message was both a warning and a twisted invitation to maintain a balance of power, which suited me given my strained relations with the crown. Thinking he had made an impact, Leon pressed on. "We know you have deep ties to Count Rochefort in France City, who has provided you with gold and elite troops. We even suspect your relationship with his daughter, the Knight Charlotte, is more than mere friendship." I smiled coldly. "If you intend to report this to the king, don't bother. I've already divorced the princess." "A misunderstanding." Leon waved his hands. "We have no interest in your private life. We only want to point out that the situation has changed. The Plantagenet kingdom is crumbling. Queen Mother Catherine rules from behind the curtain. King Sigmund is weak, and rebels rise in the south. You are too talented to die for that mother and son." Leon gestured to the landscape. "Look at Gustav or Black Hawk William. They all seek the throne. Why shouldn't you? You have the troops, the territory, and the support. Do you not have the ambition to claim the crown? You have Count Rochefort, your father Duke Schmidt, and your trump card, Princess Louise. The rulers in play are illegitimate. Raise the banner of removing the evil queen, and the realm will follow. The throne could be yours." Leon offered the Solonians sincerity. "We can be your allies. We will tie down Count Eisenberg's 10,000 cavalry so they cannot return to the capital. Why waste your strength fighting us when the entire kingdom could be your stepping stone?" I listened silently, though I scoffed internally. I had already considered these alliances. My father and father-in-law were indeed the strongest forces in the realm. I despised the court in play, and my divorce had already severed my ties to the crown. The throne was tempting, but now was not the time for rebellion. I had not finished consolidating my power, and the Solon threat remained. I would not turn my back on a tiger to chase a crown. Harold's kindness was merely a ploy to make me turn inward, giving the Solonians a chance to recover. "Your words make sense," I said calmly. "I will consider them." I shifted the topic. "As for your request for peace, I accept. My troops will not initiate hostilities within the agreed borders." Leon felt a surge of relief. He had secured the breathing room his people needed. "Excellent. Let us use the Black Forest Valley as the border, with a 10-kilometer demilitarized zone on either side." "Agreed," I replied. The valley was a natural buffer that benefited both sides. "Then I shall return to report this good news to His Majesty." Leon stood and bowed ceremoniously. "I hope so," I replied, standing up as well. Leon and his remaining envoys were escorted out of the outpost by Confort soldiers, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. I watched them go, my gaze as sharp as a hawk's. "My lord," Richter whispered, "are we truly negotiating peace with the Solonians?" I sneered. "Peace? We need time, not a truce." I looked toward the dawn. "Start the Intelligence Bureau's propaganda campaign. With these 5 heads, my words carry weight, and no one will care about my marriage anymore." Richter saluted and left. I watched the direction the Solon envoy had vanished. Harold hoped to use the crown to stall, but my goal was more than a throne. The Northern Territory threat had to be eradicated. Until then, internal strife was merely an illusion. The 5 heads, packed in rough wooden boxes, were rushed to the royal capital, Place City, alongside my bloody oath. This caused a stir among the hardline nobility. The Intelligence Bureau's campaign successfully reframed me as the northern frontier's toughest shield, shifting focus from my divorce to my military merit. Public criticism waned, replaced by a grudging respect for my defiance against the Solonians. Under the shadow of the Solon army, my reputation recovered through a mix of martial success and controlled narrative. Despite the public peace, the tacit agreement from the outpost meeting held firm. Leon and Thorstein's cavalry withdrew to the border. Richter's Field Special Operations Unit ceased their sabotage operations. The border fell into an eerie silence, broken only by wary patrols and the occasional stray arrow. This quiet bought Conford precious time for development, and I focused entirely on internal affairs. I expanded the army, integrating 5,000 new recruits into veteran units for intensive training. Brendan and Roland drilled 30,000 militia, focusing on drill, basic musket operation, and defensive discipline. Women were organized to handle battlefield first aid, bandaging, and casualty transport. Conford transformed into a war machine, mobilizing every available resource. Defensive construction hit a fever pitch. Z-shaped trenches and earthen slopes surrounded the city, while foundations for new bastions rose rapidly. I ordered the construction of forward support points, fortified farms, and small castles to create a layered, elastic defense. These outposts were stocked with supplies and guarded by small, mobile units. Their purpose was to delay, deplete, and warn. When the Solon army arrived, these outposts would inflict casualties before drawing the enemy into deeper, trap-filled defensive zones. A ruthless, scorched earth policy was also finalized. Plans were drawn to evacuate villages, poison wells, burn crops, and destroy roads along the enemy's path. The goal was to ensure every step the Solonians took cost them dearly in a desolate, hostile land. The Ordnance Bureau ramped up production of elephant heavy cannons, falconets, minion cannons, and improved landmines. Engineers secretly planted these landmines along key bridges, mountain passes, and potential deployment zones. The hidden mines served as both a physical barrier and a psychological weapon, ensuring the Solonians would face death with every step. Everyone knew the peace was merely the calm before the storm. Harold was gathering tribes and siege equipment, preparing to crush Conford once and for all. I, meanwhile, was turning Conford into a steel hedgehog, ready to bleed the enemy dry. Both sides were stockpiling strength for the inevitable collision that would decide the fate of the northern frontier. With Edgar's efficient administration and the military training led by Brendan and Roland, I was freed from daily minutiae. I focused on high-level strategy, allowing me more time with Charlotte and Klein. I finished my work by dusk and rode back to the castle. At dinner, Lady Isabella was cold but silent. Charlotte spoke more, asking about the walls or sharing Klein's new milestones. After dinner, they focused entirely on Klein. I clumsily learned to change diapers and help my son stand. Charlotte watched, occasionally guiding me or laughing at my awkwardness. When Klein slept, they walked in the castle garden. The nights were cold, but the silence between them was no longer suffocating. They spoke of the past and future, avoiding sensitive topics. I felt the ice between them slowly melting. Trust and a sense of shared responsibility as parents began to bridge the gap. Yet, the estrangement remained like an old scar that ached in the rain. There was no intimacy. Their embraces were restrained, and they remained apart. Charlotte's acceptance felt like a deliberate choice rather than a return of love. The betrayal had left deep wounds that might never fully heal. I understood this. Charlotte's decision to move forward for Klein's sake was a gift. I resolved to cherish this chance, using my actions to slowly warm her heart, even if the cracks remained. That afternoon, I inspected the southern bastion during a live-fire artillery drill. Cannons were positioned, aimed at a barren stretch of land. At the signal, the crews loaded and fired. Boom, boom, boom. The thunderous roars filled the air with white smoke. Heavy iron balls tore through the sky, carving perfect arcs before slamming into the earth miles away, kicking up dust and gouging deep trenches into the ground. Observers and engineers rushed to the field, marking impact craters with colorful flags and lime circles. They were calibrating artillery ranges for specific elevations. Once enemies entered these zones, gunners could fire immediately using pre-calculated charges and angles for maximum coverage. I stood behind the bastion's battlements, watching the dust and activity with a sense of relief. The gears of war were turning. Returning to the castle at dusk, I found the atmosphere quiet. In the main hall, Lady Isabella sat by the fireplace, reading poetry while watching Klein crawl after a yarn ball. "My lady." I greeted her, still uncomfortable around my sharp-tongued mother-in-law. Isabella glanced at me dismissively before returning her gaze to her grandson. Charlotte went out riding for exercise. My heart skipped a beat. Had she gone to Amber Bay to confront Louise? Despite my previous reassurances, the thought made me anxious. I picked up my son, who crawled toward me, to hide my unease. Klein grabbed my collar and babbled, "Pa, Pa," softening my heart instantly. She took her bow, Isabella added flatly, as if reading my mind. She went hunting. Charlotte entered the hall just then, her footsteps echoing. She wore mud-splattered hunting leathers, her short blonde hair windswept, her cheeks flushed with vitality. A servant followed, carrying 2 rabbits and a pheasant. Charlotte's quiver held only a few arrows. Her eyes sparkled with the lingering excitement of the hunt. She radiated a vibrant, living energy, a stark contrast to her usual weary, stoic demeanor. Bathed in the sunset, she looked radiant. I was mesmerized. She reminded me of the young knight I had fallen for back in Conford, confident, wild, and resilient. For a moment, the burdens of the past faded away. "Carl." Charlotte tilted her head, confused by my stare. "Is there something on my face?" "No, nothing," I stammered, handing her Klein. "He's hungry." Charlotte smiled, a look that moved me deeply. She handed her gear to a servant and took her son, who nuzzled into her neck. As the little one neared Anna, I caught her familiar scent, nuzzling into her neck with a dependent whimper. "Good haul?" I asked. "Not too rusty," she replied proudly. "Shall we have a feast tonight?" "Yes," I agreed, unable to look away. Outside, the northern wind lashed against the walls of Flossgard. Inside, firelight illuminated the rugged faces of Solon tribal leaders and generals. Solon soldiers and slaves unloaded 10 heavy bronze cannons from wagons. The weapons bore the Plantagenet royal iris and workshop inscriptions, gifts from their southern enemies. These were gifts from their ancestral enemies in the south, the Plantagenet kingdom. Harold sat on his throne, watching the man kneeling before him. Luoyao, dressed in Solon leather but clearly a southerner. That man was none other than Luoyao. After fleeing the disaster at Conford months ago, Luoyao had begged for his life at the northern border. Initially treated with contempt, he survived by proving his worth. Luoyao betrayed every detail of the field territory's defenses, Conford's tactics, and my personality. He painted himself as a man who had seen the light, denouncing the Plantagenets while praising Harold's strength. Harold, ambitious for conquest, saw the utility in a man who knew his enemy's secrets and hated me. A former Plantagenet general who understood the kingdom's inner workings, knew Conford, and harbored a deep hatred for me was worth far more than the meager remnants of troops I brought with me. My symbolic value and intelligence were invaluable. Harold spared him and appointed him commander of the new Musketeer Guard, a unit equipped with captured firearms. This role bound Luoyao to the Solon Corps, serving as both a promotion and a leash. Kneeling, Luoyao spoke in fluent Solon. "My king, herald of the north, your glory is the eternal star. I have long admired your strength from the corrupt south. To stand before you is my greatest honor." He looked up, eyes burning with fervor. "Your warriors have swept the north. The Great Wall is but a fence to you. Only one tumor remains, Conford, held by that thief. I. Luoyao urged King Harold to strike me at Conford, calling me the final, most dangerous obstacle to Solon's southern expansion and a festering threat to the kingdom. Luoyao pleaded for a full mobilization of Solon's warriors to crush Conford, eradicate me, and clear the path for Solon's banners to dominate the northern territory. His words deeply stirred the Solon generals, who hungered for glory and plunder. However, the court was divided. Harold had long desired to attack me, a sentiment intensified by Conford's persistent cavalry raids. Yet, many veteran tribal leaders and legion commanders feared Conford's defenses. Memories of past defeats and the high cost of facing my advanced weapons and fortifications made them wary of a direct assault. Led by Ulf, the cautious faction advocated for traditional tactics, bypassing Conford to raid the wealthy southern heartlands through weaker sections of the northern Great Wall. Harold asked Ulf for his opinion on Luoyao's proposal. Ulf stood, noting that while Luoyao was right about the threat, I had strengthened my alliance with Count Rochefort. Ulf warned that breaking my marriage to the princess meant I was likely securing Count Rochefort's support, meaning they would face not just 10,000 Conford troops, but also the elite Northern Territory Legion from France City. He argued that assaulting a prepared, reinforced fortress was unwise. Their warriors should fight in open fields where their horse archery could shine. Ulf's caution resonated with several other conservative generals. Harold remained non-committal and turned to Sven. Sven rose abruptly, insisting that Conford must be attacked immediately. He pointed to my rapid evolution, from a small mountain castle to a force-wielding flintlock muskets, small bronze cannons, quick-firing cannons, and deadly landmines. Sven warned that I was expanding into the southwest peninsula and training thousands of cavalry. If they didn't crush me now, I would become unstoppable. Sven's blunt assessment of the visible threat shook the hesitant generals. Gron jumped up, agreeing that I must be destroyed before I grew stronger, noting the immense wealth, grain, and workshops they would seize upon victory. The hall erupted in shouts for war and vengeance. Faced with the overwhelming fervor, Ulf fell silent, though he remained deeply concerned. Harold rose, his massive presence silencing the room. He scanned his generals, his gaze seemingly fixed on the south. Harold mocked the Plantagenet kingdom for sending cannons to incite a mutual slaughter, declaring that the victor of this clash would only emerge stronger. He vowed that Conford would be raised to secure Solon's future. Harold estimated their combined enemy force at 30,000, while Solon could mobilize over 100,000, ensuring a crushing numerical advantage. Asgir questioned the cost of assaulting such strong defenses. Harold countered that my expansion into the plains had exposed my workshops, warehouses, and farms, making the city impossible to defend from behind mountain walls alone. He emphasized that the siege was a lucrative hunt for grain, advanced weaponry, skilled labor, and the wealth of the bank, which would more than compensate for their losses. Harold ordered a total mobilization, stop all minor raiding, stockpile supplies, build siege engines, and prepare for a war of total conquest against Conford. The generals roared their agreement. Luoyao smiled, his expression a mix of hatred and ambition. Harold asked his logistics minister if they were prepared for a long siege with 100,000 men. The minister confirmed they had 6 months of supplies and materials, though he warned that transporting heavy artillery and siege towers would be slow and labor-intensive. Harold dismissed the concerns, ordering full preparations for a total war to grind my defenses into dust. In January of the second year of Sigmund, the Northern Territory was plunged into war. Harold tore up the peace treaty, unleashing his war machine. Tribal totems fluttered in the freezing wind. A massive, endless column moved south, led by 50,000 elite Solon warriors in chainmail and leather armor. Behind them followed 30,000 tribal auxiliaries and Luoyao's Plantagenet defectors. The rear consisted of 30,000 slaves and 10,000 laborers hauling supplies, grain, and siege components. Over 100,000 strong, the Solon army moved like a mountain of steel and flesh toward Conford. However, their advance was immediately stalled upon entering Conford's territory. They found a scorched earth landscape, empty villages, poisoned wells, burned crops, and destroyed infrastructure. Worse, Conford's mobile units utilized the terrain to launch hit-and-run attacks, using landmines and ambushes to bleed the supply lines. Solon hunters, skilled in tracking, pressured Carnford's skirmishers, forcing them to abandon forward positions. However, landmines remained a constant, paralyzing threat that spread panic through the marching Solon ranks. After heavy losses, the Solon vanguard cleared a supply route for the main army. As the main force reached the border, my scorched earth and delay tactics began to exert real pressure. No longer content to be harassed, the Solon vanguard moved to eliminate Carnford's key outposts. These small, strategically placed forts controlled mountain passes, river bends, and high ground, proving exceptionally sturdy. Lacking heavy siege equipment, Solon light cavalry and infantry struggled against these stone boxes, which featured firing ports and simple bastions. It took 5 days and hundreds of casualties for Solon to capture Nalan Castle through sheer numbers and suicidal assaults. The victory was hollow. The castle was stripped of supplies, and the wells were poisoned, killing thirsty Solon soldiers instantly. Worse, the retreating Carnford garrison had seeded the ruins and paths with booby traps and tripwires, causing further chaos and casualties. The vanguard was forced to advance with agonizing, time-consuming caution. Days later, Solon's elite cavalry finally caught up to Leon's rearguard in Grey Wolf Valley. Utilizing the hilly terrain, Leon avoided a direct clash, instead using hit-and-run tactics to exhaust the weary Solon cavalry, leading to a stalemate. News then arrived that Harold's main force was approaching. Leon immediately withdrew, leaving behind engineers to plant more landmines, pits, and tripwires to hinder pursuit. As King Harold entered the Carnford zone, witnessing the scorched villages, destroyed roads, and the terror among his men, he remained unmoved. He dismissed my tactics as mere tricks that could not overcome the disparity in raw power. Upon confirming the Solon army's full arrival, I ordered all outposts to retreat to the second line of defense, effectively trapping Harold deep within Carnford territory. Overnight, all minor resistance vanished. The Solon army's advance became suspiciously smooth, masking a gathering storm. Harold's 100,000-strong force had been lured into a massive, multi-layered slaughterhouse centered on Carnford main city, filled with trenches, bastions, and traps. Ulf, having overextended in pursuit of Leon, suffered dozens of casualties in a sharp counterattack and was forced to regroup miles back. He climbed a northern height and raised his brass telescope to survey the target. The sight chilled the veteran commander to the bone. The plains below Carnford had been transformed into a grotesque, three-dimensional defensive maze. The perimeter was lined with deep, Z-shaped counterslope trenches. The trench edges were steep, and the bottoms were bristling with sharpened stakes and caltrops. Ulf suspected the seemingly flat ground ahead was riddled with hidden landmines. Excavated earth had been packed into a 5-meter-high sloped wall designed to deflect cannon fire rather than block infantry. Hundreds of cannon barrels protruded from this wall, far exceeding Ulf's estimates. Though mostly light falconets or minion cannons, their dense, interlocking fire would shred any approaching force. Beyond the wall lay the main city wall. The wall featured pentagonal bastions at regular intervals. These bastions provided perfect crossfire coverage, eliminating all blind spots and ensuring attackers would be hit from 3 sides simultaneously. The walls were reinforced, with additional artillery and troops visible behind the battlements. The area between the trenches and the wall was scarred with countless foxholes and pits. Ulf realized these were for infantry and snipers to harass engineers and attackers, significantly increasing the difficulty of any siege. His captain of the guard turned pale, gasping at the sight. Ulf lowered his telescope, looking at the spruce banner atop the castle. He questioned how Harold could possibly overcome this, knowing the king was now committed to a hopeless assault. 2 days later, the Solon main force flooded the fields north of Carnford. Countless banners danced in the wind as leather tents covered the hills. Dust clouds on the northern road signaled that more supplies and troops were still arriving. Thousands of sleighs were driven to build camp infrastructure. However, with all surrounding villages and fields burned, Harold's hopes for local foraging were crushed, placing immense strain on his logistics. Harold stood on a high ridge, silently observing the Carnford defensive complex, which loomed like a steel beast in the winter gloom. Even the battle-hardened Solan warriors felt a heavy, unprecedented sense of dread. They had expected resistance, but not a fortress of this magnitude built in mere months. It was a deep, multi-dimensional kill zone of trenches, walls, and artillery. Even if they breached these, the main castle atop the mountain remained. Ulf, standing behind Harold, noted the potential threat of the Amber Bay Navy and the rumored defensive alliance between Count Rockefort's Franz City and Carnford. His previous excitement had turned to cold mockery. He remarked to the nearby generals that clearing the trenches, stakes, and mines would cost thousands of lives, perhaps more than 10,000. He pointed to the hundreds of cannons on the wall, questioning how many soldiers would survive the barrage to even reach the walls with their ladders. His words chilled the restless generals, replacing their battle fervor with palpable anxiety and uneasy glances. What they expected to be a swift conquest now loomed as a bottomless pit demanding endless lives. Harold sat motionless atop his massive black warhorse, a mountain of a man. His usual sharp, ambitious gaze dimmed. His gray-blue eyes were locked onto Carnford, as if trying to pierce its defenses and stare down the rival he both hated and respected. His grand ambitions had collided with an immovable wall. With the nation's entire army mobilized, the target remained a prickly, impenetrable hedgehog. A cold wind swept the wasteland, carrying the scent of scorched earth and ominous foreboding. After a long silence, Harold hissed through gritted teeth, damn you. I was detestable, but the die was cast. With 100,000 troops and massive logistics, there was no turning back. To retreat now would be to admit that the Solan war machine feared me, and that Harold, the king of Solan, feared a border lord. Such news would shatter morale, proving more fatal than any battlefield defeat. If the king feared Carnford, the soldiers would surely lose their will to fight before even engaging. He would rather suffer heavy losses or a defeat than lose the army's spirit, which would cost 10 times the blood to reclaim. He shook his head violently, casting aside his internal dread and the grim casualty projections. He was Harold, the destined conqueror of the South, his resolve hardening once more. Hiya! Harold spurred his horse, galloping toward a high mound, followed by his guards and generals. At the summit, he turned to face his vast, banner-filled army and the daunting, silent fortress of Carnford. Solan warriors, chieftains, loyal generals. Look ahead. Carnford is the final obstacle to our southern expansion. Recall our history. Have we ever retreated from a fortress or feared an enemy? He paused for effect. We did not avoid Carnford and Franz City out of fear, but as a wolf crouching before the strike. Today is the day for our thunderous, decisive assault. He brandished his sword. Carnford must fall. I must die. This is for our honor, our southern path, and for the fertile lands, homes, and wealth that await you. Seeing the fire return to their eyes, Harold knew the moment was right. Hear my decree, rest tonight. At dawn, we begin digging trenches and deploying siege engines. The total assault begins. To inspire you, I offer rewards based on our ancestors' glory. The first to cross the outer trench will receive a 2-rank promotion, 100 acres of land, 200 silver, and fine silks. A low murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. The first to plant our flag on the outer wall will be promoted 3 ranks, up to Legion Commander, and receive 2 estates, 500 silver, and 10 fine horses. The stakes rose, and the eyes of the officers and soldiers burned with greed. And for the bravest, whoever scales the main wall of Carnford and plants our flag, I promise, immediate entry into the Wolf Legion, a 4-rank promotion, 5 estates, 1,000 silver, and 3 generations of tax exemption. A deafening roar erupted from the Solan army. The Wolf Legion, massive wealth, and social elevation. Greed and ambition instantly eclipsed their fear. Harold's tone suddenly turned icy, cutting through the cheers. However, the field fell deathly silent. Any who show cowardice, flee, or shake the army's resolve will be executed on the spot. Their men will be enslaved, their women sold as camp followers, and their families ruined forever. I mean what I say. With a mix of extreme temptation and brutal punishment, Harold mastered his complex, plunder-driven army. For the king, For Solon, Sven shouted, drawing his blade. For the king. For Solon. Level Conford. The other generals echoed, whether sincere or coerced. Ulf remained grim but saluted, signaling his compliance. The thunderous war cries rolled toward Conford. Harold exhaled, staring at the silent fortress. He knew slogans could only do so much. This hard nut would require blood, lives, and iron determination. He knew that from tomorrow, the land before Conford would be soaked in Solon blood, but he had no other choice. Carl, Harold whispered to himself, are you trembling in your iron shell, or are you, like me, waiting for the feast to begin? Meanwhile, on the observation deck of Conford's main bastion, I watched the Solon movements. The wind whipped my cloak as I peered through my telescope at the vast, terrifying sea of Solon tents and banners. The sheer scale of the 100,000-strong army would suffocate any defender, but to me, they were merely a beast clawing at a tank. I observed their caution before my outer defenses. My death maze was already working. Paper tigers, I murmured, confident that the Solonians would break themselves against my defenses of wit and steel. A familiar, faint scent and soft, steady footsteps approached. I didn't turn. I knew who it was. Charlotte walked to my side, standing with me. Charlotte donned a dark blue hunting outfit with a fox-fur-trimmed cloak. The wind caught her short blonde hair, revealing a firm, determined jawline. Unlike my analytical calm, her eyes burned with the excitement of a natural warrior sensing the battlefield. The Rochefort family's bellicose blood flowed through her. The bloody battles at Hoenham had only tempered her resolve. As the cold wind carried her scent, I looked at her focused, wind-reddened face, feeling a surge of complex emotions. Charlotte, I said softly, the Solon main force is here. It's too dangerous. Take Anna and Klein to France City. The Count is safer there. I can't guarantee anything in war. Charlotte interrupted, her blue eyes meeting mine with unwavering clarity. My husband is fighting to defend our home, she said calmly. How could I hide in the rear with our child? She stepped closer. Carl, I believe in you, your walls, your soldiers, and your preparations. More than that, I would rather die here with you than live alone. The words struck my heart like a warm current. Her simple, heavy vow silenced my protests, leaving me choked with emotion. Her choice to live or die by my side moved me more than any romantic declaration. Still, I worried. But Klein, he's so young. And Mother, I'll handle Mother. As for Klein, Charlotte said firmly, he is the heir to Conford. If he must face war, his parents should be fighting beside him. We have secret tunnels and ships if the worst happens. She had clearly considered the contingencies. She took my hand, gesturing to the trenches, earthworks, cannons, and the disciplined soldiers behind the walls. Look at what you've built. Harold's 10,000 men will bleed dry against these walls. I believe in you, Carl. We will win. Her warmth and confidence anchored me. My last shred of doubt vanished. I squeezed her hand and nodded. Yes, I replied, my voice heavy with resolve. Under the leaden winter sky, the roar of Solon artillery dominated the fields north of Conford. 50 cannons were deployed along the Solon front. The arsenal included local Solon pieces, captured Plantagenet field guns, and 10 formidable, long-barreled heavy bronze cannons, a gift from the kingdom. Harold had committed his entire long-range battery to this opening volley. Sweat-drenched gunners worked feverishly in the biting cold, ramming powder charges and iron shot into the breeches before igniting them. Ready, fire! Orange flames erupted along the Solon line, the thunderous roar shaking the earth as thick smoke obscured the field. Iron balls of various calibers screamed through the air toward the Conford earthworks. The shots kicked up clouds of frozen earth and debris, but the thick, soft slopes of the earthworks absorbed the impact, suffering no structural damage. The Conford line remained eerily silent. No flags waved, no soldiers shouted, and not a single cannon returned fire. The silent wall stood like a sleeping beast, ignoring the mosquito bites, a silence more unnerving than any counterattack. Harold had targeted the relatively flat center of the northern line after careful deliberation. The west was mountainous, heavily fortified with trenches and breastworks that made frontal assaults suicidal. The east faced Amber Bay, where my fleet, feared for its broadside cannons, patrolled. With me able to reinforce the flanks via interior lines, the center, despite its defenses, was the most viable target. Yet, Conford's silence was not passivity. From the main castle on Conford Mountain, several long-range cannons roared. These high-caliber guns, firing at maximum elevation, lobbed 6-pound iron balls in high arcs toward the Solon rear. The projectiles fell almost vertically, carrying terrifying kinetic energy. Whoosh boom! The shells slammed into the ground or crowds, creating massive craters. Those struck directly were obliterated, leaving nothing but gore and armor fragments. Even near misses caused severe casualties through shockwaves and flying frozen debris. This unpredictable fire from above forced the Solon troops to scatter, disrupting their formation and momentum. Amidst the artillery exchange, Solon engineers drove slaves forward to dig approach trenches. It was a classic, albeit desperate, tactic. Charging the bastion defenses directly was suicide. Digging was the only way to close the distance. However, Conford had anticipated this, pre-digging countless foxholes and anti-infantry trenches across the open field. These obstacles significantly delayed the Solon engineers. "Dig, you lazy dogs!" Thomas roared, his voice raspy, as he struck a slow slave with a wooden club. Thomas, a Plantagenet who had joined the Solon auxiliary forces after Einar praised his work at Eaglenest, was undergoing another grim transformation. Thomas wore rough, ill-fitting leather armor and carried a cheap iron blade. His face betrayed a mix of pride in his new status as a Solon servant soldier and deep terror at his current plight. As a leader of 30 slaves, his glory was ironic. He was forcing them to dig their own graves under the guns of the Conford garrison. Shovels struck frozen earth with rhythmic clangs. Driven by Thomas and the looming threat of the Solon execution squad, the gaunt, numb slaves dug frantically. They were building a forward staging area. Though the Conford cannons remained silent, the distance to the earthen walls offered no true safety. Bang! A sharp crack echoed from a hidden foxhole near Conford. A slave, overextending while digging, stiffened and collapsed like a felled tree, his shovel flying away. A gruesome hole in his neck sprayed blood, staining the frozen mud and his companion's rags. He couldn't even scream, clutching his throat with wide, terrified eyes before dying instantly. It was a sniper using a rifled musket, not a standard smoothbore. These rare, precise weapons allowed patient hunters in camouflaged foxholes to pick off targets within 200 meters. "Get down!" Thomas shrieked, diving into the shallow trench, his heart hammering. The slaves panicked. Some wept or wet themselves in terror. "No retreating!" The Solon officer roared from behind, accompanied by the sound of drawn blades. Thomas sweated profusely. If the line failed, he would be executed as the person in charge. He had to survive for the woman waiting in Flossgard and their unborn child. "Get up!" Thomas scrambled out, brandishing his blade and striking a cowering slave. "Keep digging. Stay low. Do it or die." Under the threat of immediate death, the slaves resumed digging, moving with desperate, low-profile caution that crippled their efficiency. The air reeked of blood, sweat, and fear. Solon's musketeer guard sent 200 men forward to suppress the snipers. The Solonians were at a disadvantage. They were exposed, while the Conford snipers held fortified positions with superior rifled muskets. The exchange was one-sided. Solon musketeers fell one by one, their volleys failing to threaten the hidden snipers. Whoosh boom! A piercing whistle cut through the gunfire. Thomas pressed himself into the trench, shielding his head. Boom! Bang! Artillery from the mountains slammed into the work zone, showering the area with earth, rock, and human remains. When the ringing in his ears subsided, Thomas peered over the trench edge. A massive crater had replaced the area where another slave squad had been working. Dismembered bodies and broken tools littered the blood-soaked earth. The survivors screamed in agony. The stench of blood and gunpowder was overwhelming. Thomas fought back the urge to vomit, shivering as the dying groans of the wounded echoed around him. This initial probe of 1,000 men had been decimated by Conford's defenses, and the main defensive system hadn't even fully engaged yet. Huddled in the trench, Thomas stared at the Hell's Cape. Could this place even be taken? How long would he last? This slaughter continued for days on the plains north of Conford. The initial 1,000 men were consumed like firewood by mines, snipers, and artillery. Harold sent 5,000 more, forcing slaves and servants to advance inch by bloody inch. Thomas watched his men cycle through, replaced as they were cut down by lead, shrapnel, or the execution squad. Death spared only him. Like a rat in a slaughterhouse, he survived through instinct, luck, and a desperate obsession with returning home, sustaining only minor wounds. The sky hung heavy and gray. Einar approached the trench and kicked the cowering Thomas. "Thomas, look ahead." Einar pointed at the Conford walls. "Check the distance and the markers. The officers need a report." Thomas felt his blood run cold. To peek out was to invite a sniper's bullet. Countless men had died doing exactly this. Experienced survivors now moved like moles, minimizing exposure. But Einar's cold gaze and the execution squad behind him left Thomas no choice. I licked my cracked lips, inhaled the freezing, blood-scented air, and slowly, agonizingly, pushed my head and one eye above the trench line. I felt the frozen earth scrape my forehead, every movement straining my shattered nerves to the breaking point. Thomas stared at the Conford earthworks 300 paces away, close enough to discern details on the wall. The wall featured gaps for artillery, with dark cannon muzzles pointed toward them. Above the gaps, sandbagged emplacements housed light falconets and heavier Saker cannons. A blue-green flag bearing a spruce emblem fluttered arrogantly in the cold wind. The open ground before the wall was unrecognizable. It was a maze of trenches, craters, and large stones marked with red and white paint. Thomas knew these stones were range markers for Conford's gunners, a deadly detail confirmed by fleeing Plantagenet deserters. Despite his fierce exterior, Thomas was terrified. Having survived an early skirmish against me years ago, he knew the true danger of Conford. He trusted the rumors of the Conford army's prowess more than anyone. He had heard how they crushed Bragi's elite Wolf Legion in melee, a feat that filled him with dread. A red flash erupted from a wall gap, followed by a plume of white smoke. Whoosh! A 4-pound solid shot from a minion cannon tore through the air. It struck the frozen ground 2/3 of the way, kicking up a cloud of ice and dust. The ball skipped forward, its trajectory erratic, heading straight for a trench where men were digging. Boom! The impact shattered the trench edge, showering the Solonians with frozen earth, debris, and human remains. Thomas felt the sting of flying shrapnel. Nearby, 5 or 6 men were mangled by the ricochet. My legs are gone," the wounded screamed. Instead of aid, the execution squad arrived with cold steel. 2 executioners jumped into the trench, their scimitars flashing as they butchered the screaming wounded. They cleared the bodies like trash, their cold eyes cowing the remaining terrified slaves. "Keep moving. Fill the pits. Now," the officer roared. Driven by terror, the survivors scrambled to fill trenches with dirt, rocks, and the corpses of their comrades. As they neared the wall, Conford's fire intensified. At least 10 emplacements rained fire with minion and falconet cannons. The gunners were highly trained, using pre-calibrated angles and charges. They used the frozen ground to skip solid shots, maximizing lethality against exposed infantry. The standardized charges ensured consistent, devastating hits within the killing zone. Digging squads were repeatedly wiped out by the skipping iron balls. The screams of the wounded were silenced only by the blades of the execution squad. The front line became a meat grinder, with reinforcements dying as quickly as they arrived. Casualties mounted and morale shattered. Those who broke and ran were shot down by the execution squad, their bodies serving as grim warnings. Thomas huddled against the trench wall, gasping for air. The air reeked of gunpowder, blood, and excrement. Watching his hollow-eyed companions, he realized the truth. They were merely walking into a slaughterhouse, measuring the final distance to the wall with their own lives. Meanwhile, Amber Bay was a hive of activity, far removed from the carnage at the front. Hundreds of lanterns turned the docks into a bright, bustling hub. Ships arrived from the south, unloading vital supplies under the guidance of harbor masters. Duke Schmidt sent weapons, grain, and elite mercenary reinforcements, who were immediately organized for the front. Queen Mother Catherine publicly preached support for the northern frontier to maintain her reputation. Privately, she obstructed aid, citing road repairs and bureaucratic delays to keep the north isolated. Other southern lords remained neutral, hoping I and the Solonians would destroy each other. Only Duke Schmidt continued to pour resources into Confort. He kept the supply lines open via the sea. Simultaneously, Count Rochefort mobilized 20,000 troops in France City, ready to strike once the battle reached a turning point. The tide of war was slowly shifting. As the Solonians bled out at Confort, Harold's position grew increasingly dire. I patrolled the Confort walls in a heavy fur cloak, flanked by my guards. Brendan and Edgar followed, ready to report. Bitter night winds whipped through the battlements, casting flickering shadows across the exhausted soldiers. I instructed Edgar to prioritize supplies for new arrivals from Amber Bay, ensure mercenaries were paid and disciplined under my own officers, and guarantee medical supplies for the wounded. Edgar confirmed that barracks were ready, mercenaries were being integrated, and all logistics were meticulously tracked. I asked about defense and morale. Brendan reported the deployment. The 1st Regiment held the west, the 2nd the east/Amber Bay sector, and the 3rd held the central earth wall with heavy artillery. A 1,000-strong cavalry reserve waited behind the 2nd wall, supported by 3,000 auxiliaries handling logistics and secondary defense. The 4th Regiment rested as a reserve. Solonians had spent 10 days digging trenches, now within 100 paces of the first line. At this range, artillery canister shot was devastating. Solonian casualties were 300 to 500 daily, mostly slaves, though regulars were also suffering. They had slowed recently, but were now pushing slaves forward to clear obstacles. I inspected a bastion. The pentagonal bastion allowed for multi-directional fire, with ammunition storage below and firing ports above. This design eliminated blind spots at the wall's base. I remarked that while a frontal assault was impossible, history showed fortresses usually fell from within. Brendan confirmed that supplies were split into 5 independent, guarded, and reinforced depots, with strict protocols and rotating passwords to prevent sabotage. I was satisfied. I dismissed my officers to walk the wall alone, watching the distant Solonian campfires. Brendan and Edgar withdrew into the shadows. I continued my solitary patrol. Soldiers slept in shifts against the walls, exhausted. Sentries remained alert, and artillery crews stood by their cooling cannons. The bastions, which I had personally designed, loomed like fangs in the night. I felt a sudden, strange doubt. I questioned if Harold could truly breach these defenses, given the heavy toll the outer earthworks had already exacted. The 5-meter-high earth wall, backed by crossfire and artillery, made infantry charges suicidal. I looked down from a northern battlement. A deep, 10-meter-wide moat filled with spikes and caltrops guarded the base. Even if they breached the wall, the Solonians would face a gauntlet of fire while crossing the moat and scaling the main wall. Beyond the moat, the 4th Regiment waited behind the earth wall. The artillery positions were ready to unleash death at a moment's notice. I decided to inspect the first line of defense. I crossed the wooden bridge over the moat. Below, the spikes and caltrops gleamed in the dark. The air near the earth wall reeked of gunpowder, blood, and scorched earth. Occasional dull thuds echoed as the garrison fired harassing shots. These shots were meant to deny the Solonians rest and drain their morale. I climbed the muddy slope of the earth wall and peered through a firing port. The Solonian trench network looked like a scar on the earth. The zigzagging trenches were designed to minimize artillery impact. The front line was indeed less than 100 paces away. A sniper's shot extinguished a flickering light in the enemy camp. I acknowledged the Solonians' impressive engineering under fire. Harold clearly had competent officers, likely defectors from the Plantagenet side. Yet, I knew the final 100 paces would be hell. At this range, direct fire artillery, canister shot, and hidden landmines would decimate the attackers. The cost for the Solonians to clear these obstacles would be catastrophic. Leaning against the wall, I realized it was time to move beyond mere defense. Passive defense was not enough. The Solonian logistics were strained, and their morale was waning. With reinforcements arriving via Amber Bay and Duke Schmidt's support, the time for a counteroffensive was approaching. I planned to strike back like a hammer, crippling Harold's army so severely that they would be unable to threaten the South for years, potentially opening a window for my own expansion. I took a final look at the Solon camp's flickering lights before retreating into the shadows of Conford. Driven by the Solonians, the slave-dug trench network had reached within 100 meters of the Conford breastwork. This distance placed the wall within effective range of light artillery. Under cover of darkness, the Solonians moved light field guns into newly established forward positions via the reinforced trenches. At dawn, the Solonian artillery opened fire with a deafening roar. Over a dozen guns fired simultaneously, slamming iron shot into the Conford breastwork and its gun emplacements. Both sides exchanged fire, but the Conford garrison, protected by their superior fortifications, held firm. The thick, sloped design of the breastwork absorbed the solid shot, causing little structural damage or casualties. The Conford gunners quickly stabilized and began precise counter-battery fire. Adjusting their aim based on observer reports, they targeted the exposed Solonian positions. A direct hit shattered a Solonian falconet, killing or wounding the nearby crew and slaves. Another shot detonated a nearby ammunition cache, obliterating the enemy firing point. Pressured by their commanders, the Solonian vanguard launched a desperate infantry charge of 300 men. They scrambled from the trenches, attempting to cover the final 100 meters. As they hit the open ground, the Conford breastwork and bastions unleashed a storm of lead. 3 volleys from the Conford musketeers decimated the attackers. The survivors fled back to the trenches, leaving dozens of corpses behind. This failure proved that frontal assaults were suicidal until the trenches reached the wall. The brutal war of attrition intensified. The Solon Provost Corps whipped starving slaves into the dangerous work zones. Conford's relentless artillery and snipers continued to harvest the lives of the diggers. Every meter of progress was bought with blood, as slaves were forced to use the corpses of their predecessors as cover. Sensing the enemy's exhaustion, Roland ordered a decisive counterattack. A crimson flag signaled the charge, accompanied by the piercing blast of war horns and thunderous drums. Charge! Conford infantry detachments burst from hidden sally ports like tigers. The elite veterans sprinted across the open ground and occupied the outer trenches near the Solonian lines. They braced their bayonet muskets against the breastwork, aiming at the stunned slaves and overseers. Ready, fire! The volley was devastating at such close range. Slaves fell like wheat. The survivors panicked, colliding with the retreating Provost Corps in a chaotic rout. It's the Conford soldiers. Counterattack. The Solon Musketeer Guard attempted to return fire from the trench corners. However, the Conford soldiers held superior cover, maintaining better accuracy and fire density. Boom! A Conford minion cannon fired a 4-pound solid shot directly into the dense mass of Solonian musketeers and fleeing slaves. The carnage shattered the Solonian will to resist in that sector. Seizing the moment, Roland ordered a full-scale counter-assault. Conford soldiers leaped from their trenches, bayonets fixed, charging the disorganized Solonians. The panicked enemy was easily routed. Within 30 minutes, Conford had pushed the front line back hundreds of meters and seized several Solonian trenches. Roland, wary of overextending, kept his focus on tactical objectives. Having inflicted heavy casualties and disrupted the enemy's work, he ordered a withdrawal. The troops retreated in good order, bringing back captured tools and prisoners. The Solonians soon rallied, with officers driving their men forward to reclaim the lost ground. However, they were met with a lethal surprise. The Conford auxiliary troops had seeded the captured trenches with landmines and caltrops. Boom, boom, boom. Explosions tore through the Solonian ranks. Soldiers crippled by caltrops blocked the path of those behind them. This trap decimated the Solonian morale before they even made contact. By the time they reclaimed the ruined trenches, they had lost precious time and morale for zero gain. To the Solonians, the Conford breastwork now seemed more insurmountable than ever. Harold stood on a high ridge, his heavy fur cloak whipping in the wind. Through his telescope, he watched his forces retreat in disarray from the Conford counterattack. Soldiers and slaves retreated from the front lines, leaving behind a chaotic scene of casualties from mines and caltrops. Harold watched with an expressionless face, showing neither anger nor frustration. Expecting this, he lowered his binoculars and turned to his lieutenant, Sven. "Call it a day." Sven immediately ordered the retreat signal. The long, mournful horn echoed across the battlefield, cutting through the smoke. The troops withdrew in orderly fashion, retreating into the rear tunnel network. They left only a few elite sentries at key nodes to guard against any Carnford counterattacks. As night fell, the wilderness outside Carnford grew eerily silent, save for the wind and the moans of the wounded. At midnight, the silence shattered. The Solonians unleashed a violent artillery barrage. Dozens of cannons fired simultaneously, illuminating the night as solid shots and explosive shells slammed into Carnford's bastions and walls. Carnford's defenders responded instantly, their own artillery returning fire within seconds. The air filled with intersecting fire and explosions, turning the night into a deafening symphony of war. I, sleeping in my command post, was jolted awake by the intensity of the bombardment. I had moved my command center to a reinforced stone bunker near the front to manage the crisis. Despite Charlotte and Klein's previous visits, I had kept them away for safety. Now, I sat up, my heart racing. An aide entered. I donned my coat and demanded, "What's happening? Is it a night raid?" "The shelling is intense, sir, but strange," the aide reported. "There's no sign of infantry or tunneling. They're just trading fire with us." I paused. A massive, uncoordinated artillery duel in the dark made no tactical sense. The Solonians were at a disadvantage. Blind night firing would only waste ammunition and reveal their positions. "Let's go see." I stepped outside, where the air was thick with smoke and the horizon flickered with explosions. I muttered to my aide, "What is Harold planning? Night combat isn't his strength, and this blind shelling is wasteful." On the walls, the atmosphere was tense but disciplined as gunners worked to locate enemy batteries. I scanned the Solon lines with my binoculars. I saw only muzzle flashes, no infantry movement, no tunnel activity. The exchange was loud but largely ineffective, resembling an expensive, noisy fireworks display. My heart sank. Harold never acted without purpose. I left the wall, feeling a growing sense of dread. "What are you plotting, Harold?" I paced in the tunnel, deep in thought. I mentally reviewed every detail of the Carnford defenses and recent Solonian movements. I considered Carnford Mountain. It was steep and difficult to hold, lacking strategic value for a large army. Yet it had its uses. The heavy long-range cannons on the summit forced Harold to keep his main camp further north, complicating his logistics. Neutralizing those guns would grant the Solonians much-needed space. More importantly, the castle housed Charlotte and her mother, Anna. Knowing how much I valued Charlotte, Harold was likely planning a decapitation strike. The heavy bombardment was merely a distraction to fix the defenders' attention on the plains. The real threat was creeping toward the supposedly secure rear under the cover of noise and darkness. Harold's plan for the mountain had been long in the making. He had feigned disinterest in the mountain to lull the defenders into a false sense of security. Tonight's barrage was the final screen for his elite strike team. The team consisted of 100 hand-picked hunters and mountain experts, all capable of scaling the sheer cliffs. The leader was Poke, a fierce commander with a personal vendetta. Previously, at Grey Wolf territory, his forces were decimated by Oliver, and Poke himself was severely wounded. He had been left for dead, his arm run through by a spear. Harold had personally visited him and provided rare medicine. Poke made a miraculous, though scarred, recovery, regaining most of his strength. Devoted to Harold, Poke burned with the desire for revenge and the need to repay his lord's kindness. He accepted this near-suicidal mission as the ultimate honor. Now, Poke clung to the icy, moss-covered cliff face, inching upward. With a knife in his teeth, he remained tethered to his men. The wind bit into his skin, and the abyss yawned hundreds of meters below. Using picks and sheer willpower, they had been climbing for 2 hours. Their hands and knees were shredded by the rock, but they moved in total silence. Finally, Poke reached a flat edge, a forgotten platform. It was an abandoned flint mine entrance, long ignored by the defenders who deemed the cliff impassable. Poke secured his rope, signaled his men, and pressed against the cold cliff to steady his breathing while peering upward. The darkness was absolute, save for the distant, muffled thuds of artillery fire echoing against the mountain. The silence confirmed the Carnford defenders were completely unprepared for this impossible route. their attention fixed on the front-line bombardment. A grim, excited grin spread across Poke's face. Flexing his scarred arm, he envisioned the castle above and the despair of Lord Carl upon finding his family captured. Poke signaled, and his men emerged like ghosts, gathering silently behind him with blades glinting in the dark. After a brief check, they moved like a pack of wolves along the old path toward the castle's silhouette. Poke pressed his body against the damp, mossy rock face. Every movement drained the last of his elite Solan soldiers' strength and resolve. Icy winds tore at their thin night gear, threatening to peel them from the near vertical wall. Below lay a bottomless abyss. The occasional sound of falling pebbles served as a grim reminder of the fatal drop. Yet, hope remained above. Through the mist, Poke caught a glimpse of the Conford main castle's towers. One final push over the steepest section would allow them to strike like a dagger into the enemy's heart. He imagined the warmth of the castle, the panic of the female knight and her infant, and the total collapse of me. Glory, wealth, and royal favor felt within reach. The physical agony of the climb was merely a path to the summit. Almost there, he urged himself and his men. The cliff remained deathly silent, save for their labored breathing. Conford Mountain slept, unaware of their approach. The silence fueled Poke's growing premonition of success. Just as his lead scouts reached for the summit, a sharp, sudden barking erupted from the trees. The sound shattered the night's cover. Poke's heart sank. Dogs? The Conford people had dogs on the back cliff? He had never encountered guard dogs on a battlefield, let alone on such a treacherous climb. Before he could react, a voice roared in the northern dialect. Enemy attack. Back cliff. They're climbing. Orange sparks flared at the edge as torches were hurled downward. The falling torches illuminated the cliff, exposing the Solan commandos clinging to the rock like lizards. Their faces, twisted in terror, were laid bare in the firelight. There! Fire! Conford militia appeared at the edge, leveling their muskets at the exposed climbers. Ready, fire! A thunderous volley rang out. Lead bullets hailed down, the point-blank volley devastating the Solan squad. Screams erupted. The lead scouts were struck instantly, falling like broken puppets into the abyss. Others were hit in the limbs and torso, their blood staining the rocks as they plummeted. The screams were cut short by the sickening thud of bodies hitting the ground below, leaving only the scent of blood in the wind. Throw the Molotov cocktails. Don't let them up. Soldiers hurled improvised incendiaries made of clay pots and oil-soaked rags into the densest clusters of climbers. Crash. Boom. The pots shattered, engulfing the cliff in flowing, burning liquid. The stench of burning flesh filled the air as soldiers, turned into human torches, fell to their deaths. The flames illuminated the slaughter, ending any hope of a Solan counterattack. Poke instinctively pressed himself into a narrow crevice. Bullets whizzed past him, and the heat from the burning oil below scorched his skin. He heard the dying gasps and falls of his brothers in arms, each sound marking the death of a comrade. It was over. They were trapped, hanging helplessly on the cliff. They couldn't return fire. Their muskets were strapped to their backs. Retreat was impossible. The descent was too steep, and they were too exhausted. Poke's arm, once healed by royal medicine, now throbbed with agonizing, tearing pain. Sweat and ice water soaked his clothes, freezing in the night wind. He knew he couldn't hold on much longer. His strength was fading with every heartbeat. He was going to die here, on the back of Conford Mountain, in a nameless, pathetic end.